Hello. May we request everyone to please take your seats. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. All right, good morning, everyone. May we please request everyone to take your seats. We will be starting in a minute. Okay? All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to Her Excellency Constancy, Embassy of Singapore, Commodore Roy Trinidad, Deputy Commander of the Philippine Fleet, Commodore Alguer Ricafrente of the Philippine Coast Guard, distinguished guests from the government, the diplomatic community, the academe, and think tanks. I am Joyce Iles. I am the Communications and Advocacy Lead of the Strat-based ADR Institute, and I will be your host and moderator for this morning. Welcome to the Forum on Maritime Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, the role of ASEAN and its dialogue partners. Now, this event is organized by the Strat-based ADR Institute, and this is a hybrid event, so thank you very much to everyone who's here with us today in the venue, and thank you as well to everyone who's watching us online via Zoom and Facebook Live. In response to the evolving security landscape, states cooperate in different forms, levels, and sectors. And just last week, two of the biggest regional meetings were held. The 43rd ASEAN Summit last September 5 to 7 in Jakarta, Indonesia, and also the 18th East Asia Summit last September 7, also in Jakarta, Indonesia. Now today, we are bringing together government officials, members of the diplomatic community, scholars, and policy experts to discuss the outcomes of the ASEAN and East Asian summits and to exchange views on enhancing collaboration with like-minded states in response to the rising tensions and asymmetric security challenges in the region's maritime domain. So to officially open today's discussions, please welcome Strat-based ADR Institute President, Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit.
Thank you, Joyce. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us in Stratbase exactly 19 years ago, September 2004. We decided that we will bring people together. And thank you, because we continue to be successful in bringing people together because you are all with us. People from our friends from the government, thank you, the Navy, Coast Guard, from the diplomatic community, friends from civil society, academe, that I've been part of for decades, the diplomatic community. And when pandemic happened, thank you to technology, we expanded even. Not only during our events, but in terms of followers. You'll be surprised that in terms of Facebook, as we have cleansed them from trolls, we have followers in our different programs in Stratbase. It even hit 750,000 during, would I say, the dark years of the previous administration, when there were interest in maritime security, interest in governance, interest in trade and investment, and even interest in the environment. But something that is part of our tradition is we track geopolitical issues. And we started with these 8 geopolitical and even geoeconomic issues at the start of the year. And I just wanted to share this to our online participants, to our guests here. But I will focus on one of them, which is key to our discussion today. And I even wrote about it in 2 of my regular commentaries, which both came out yesterday. It's really the issue of security. And in Stratbase, we have always called it asymmetric security challenges. Yesterday, in my column in a leading business newspaper, The Business World, I spoke of like-minded states are always finding opportunity to work more closely together, driven by their shared values and commitment to the rule of law. And that is what I believe what maritime cooperation is all about. Because we have seen it the past few years as we saw countries, groupings come out with their Indo-Pacific strategies and outlooks. And allow me just to share this slide that I've shared in some forums, conferences. One of them is with Dr. Daniela in their conference a few weeks back. But it speaks of what binds all these outlooks, strategies together. The idea that we all live in a rules-based order. And through this rules-based order, based on international law, we can all coexist, cooperate, and live in a peaceful, stable Indo-Pacific region. And as the region, the Indo-Pacific region, gains geopolitical and geoeconomic importance, these strategies and outlooks illustrate a united front to address the rise of traditional, non-traditional, and evolving security threats. This demonstrates, as I've said in my Business World column, the commitment of like-minded countries and evolving to remain steadfast in the pursuit and promotion of rules-based international order. In response to the aggressive actions of coercive and antagonistic states that has brought global prosperity and robust economic growth over the past decades. As we look back and this morning, assess where we are, especially in the ASEAN region, post-ASEAN Summit, I wanted to share, as part of my discussion or opening remarks, a study on the ASEAN region done by ISEAS. But I wanted to take note of this number, 82.6% of respondents see ASEAN as slow, and ineffective, and thus cannot cope with fluid political and economic developments, becoming irrelevant in the new world order. This reflected our views in our institute, actually since 2012, when an ASEAN chair decided to turn off the microphone of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines. That was Secretary Albert de Rosario, to discuss what was happening in the West Philippine Sea. But fast forward to where we are today, that's why I go beyond ASEAN. I look at the Indo-Pacific. And as an institute, we tend to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, where ASEAN is part of. Just on the side, was nominated by two governments as the ASEAN Eminent Persons Group, even though with my policy position. So I have attended and raised these issues through time. But when you look at the statements of our dear President Marcos Jr., delivering strong statements on the Philippines' position in maintaining a rules-based international order, you see that there's a need to raise this issue. And I even wanted to share a quote when President Marcos intervened and shared his views, which is in my next slide. Our vision for the South China Sea is a sea of peace, stability, and prosperity. Today, sadly, this remains a distant reality. For our part, the Philippines will continue to work with all the countries to foster a rules-based international order. We remain committed to the peaceful resolution of dispute in the South China Sea in accordance with international law. The Philippines firmly rejects misleading narratives that frame the disputes in the South China Sea solely through the lens of strategic competition between two powerful countries. This not only denies us our independence and our agency, but it also disregards our own legitimate interests. The challenge for us remains that we must never allow international peaceful order to be subjected to the forces of might applied for hegemonic ambition. It brings me to a few years back, when the Philippines filed a case against China, and the argument of the government then, of Aquino, was the great equalizer is international law, the rules-based order, especially when you have actions by our northern neighbor sharing their latest 10-dash line map. That's why, just to make it light, I always tell Filipinos who have a habit of traveling to our beautiful beaches, northern Palawan, that be careful. You might be in Chinese territory already, especially in Coron or El Nido. Beautiful places to visit, to move around, but if you look at this map, you are in the 9-dash line, or now 10-dash line already. And this reflects what I call serious challenges that we have flagged in the Philippines. There were times that we were asked to be silent about it, to appease a trading partner that actually government data does not reflect. So please, don't believe that they're our strongest trading partner. They're not the biggest source of investment. They're a source of import. So they earn from the Philippines more than we earn from them. And there are more Filipino-Chinese businessmen who have invested in China. But the serious challenges, especially like what we saw. Imagine while the whole country was focused on the semifinal games of the FIBA World Cup. Out there in West Philippine Sea, we saw serious challenges. And we even have a dear senator talking about the intervention of a different country instead of focusing on what's happening to this resupply. With the name Robin Hood, how can you really trust his comments? But I speak of what our own president emphasizes, and I remember him saying this when he visited the Center for Strategic International Studies, that aside from maritime security conversation and agreements, he emphasized the word economic security should form a strong link between the Philippines and its neighbors. And we saw that value. We continue to see that value, not only among member ASEAN countries, but even ASEAN and its dialogue partners. President Marcos Jr. created a strong narrative against expansionist claims and has pushed for more cooperation among like-minded states. He has even emphasized maritime cooperation as a significant priority area in the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific. With this, he has certainly positioned the Philippines as a strong player in the region that can push back against antagonistic and coercive states. However, these strong statements by our leader must be backed up by strong, credible defense capabilities and reliable cooperation with our neighboring states. Our words must be supported by actions of top policymakers. That's why we try to bring people together. We can learn as third party, as non-state actors, but as state leaders like the ASEAN Summit and other summits moving forward gather, and their agreement to collectively resolve various challenges in the region provide the trust and confidence in the international community. In the Institute, we believe moving forward, the major challenge for all states in the Indo-Pacific, in the ASEAN region, is to prioritize cooperation with like-minded states while respecting the rules-based international order. United, we can confront security risk. States must be able to effectively fulfill their commitments to achieve a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. That's why 2 days back, we were happy to host our friends from India through the intervention of the Indian Embassy and the Department of Foreign Affairs. We will hear more from them this morning, but we need to bring people together from different countries, state actors, non-state actors, even private companies, private corporations, because collectively, that's the best way to move and ensure peace and stability in the region. Yesterday, my regular commentary in the Philippine Daily Inquirer came out, and I'd like to end my opening remarks. I might have taken so much time. That the defense and security challenges facing the Philippines and the region are becoming increasingly precarious because of the actions of coercive states that seek to advance their hegemonic ambitions. In the face of these threats, it's truly heartening to see nations that respect and uphold the rules-based order coming together to form closer alliance, strengthen their commitments, and work together to protect peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region, in the ASEAN region. We must stand together in solidarity to overcome these challenges. Again, good morning, and thank you for joining us here in person and also out there through Zoom link. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dindo Manhit. All right, at this point, we will now proceed to our first panel, but I'll have to step aside as they prepare the stage here in front. Okay, so for our first panel, we will be talking about negotiating the peaceful resolution of maritime issues in the ASEAN and the role of its dialogue partners. So to our participants here in the venue, should you want to ask questions later to our panelists, just feel free to raise your hand so we can see you and acknowledge you so you can ask your questions later. And we have very special guests in our panel today. And what we'll do is we'll call them one by one here, and then they'll be given 5 minutes each to deliver their opening statements. And then we will proceed to the question and answer portion of our panel. All right? So let me introduce our panelists for today. Our first panelist is Ms. Daniela Braun, Country Director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Philippines. Ma'am, maybe, yes, thank you. We also have Dr. Alma Salvador, co-convener of the Department of Political Science, Working Group on Security Sector Reform, and Associate Professor at the Ateneo de Manila University. Okay. Also joining us this morning is Dr. Chester Cabalza, President and Founder of the International Development and Security Cooperation. Also with us today is Commodore Debesh Lahiri of the Indian Navy and the Executive Director of the National Maritime Foundation. Okay. And also joining us live via Zoom is Dr. Prashant Parameswaran, a fellow at the Wilson Center and founder of the ASEAN-WONC newsletter. All right, you may take your seats now po. Is Dr. Prashant here with us? Dr. Prashant, can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Thank
Great,
you.
awesome,
Thank you for
thanks.
joining us today. All right. So to start our panel, may we ask each of you to please deliver a short 5-minute introduction or opening statement. Chester?
Yeah. Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Chester Cabalza. Thank you for inviting me here. So, shall we start with the presentation ready? I think I prepared the 5 slides for this morning because my time is only for 5 minutes. Please, anyone, can you please flash it? Okay. First of all, the title of my presentation would be Negotiating a Non-Negotiable that talks about what are the national interests of the Philippines and how do we foster or enhance, of course, regional dialogues and the importance of ASEAN. And definitely, of course, the most important here is, of course, to continue with the strength. Of course, it was already discussed by Professor Manhit on how we would foster this unified narrative that we have. And of course, what are the alternative mechanisms for the Philippines in order for us to foster cooperation with ASEAN, given that, of course, we all know that in ASEAN, it's quite polarized and divided, and we will see later on. Okay, that's the topic that I would like to share with you. Let's move to the next slide so that we can have a better appreciation of what I'm going to discuss to you this morning. Of course, as mentioned already by Professor Manhit about the 10-dash line, or everyone is disappointed with this one. We don't accept it as it is because, of course, we have the arbitral award that says that China or our giant neighbor should obey international law and maritime rules-based norms. But of course, what are the actions that the Philippines can provide in order for us to prevent such escalation of this kind of narrative, given that, of course, China has this 10-dash line ready? I think we have the archipelagic doctrine, which we had passed together with Indonesia. It's part of the UNCLOS law already that says that the archipelago becomes a single unit. What is lacking from the Philippines is that you have the Maritime Zones Act, where you have rights and obligations of the Philippines over maritime zones. We have not yet passed it. I think the lower house or the Congress has already done the 3rd reading, and in August 7, I think the Senate has their version ready. So we're waiting for the final version coming from the 2 houses. And I think the last one would be the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act that would designate sea lanes and air routes of foreign ships and aircrafts for continuous and expeditious passages. So this is something that we have to pass because what we saw in the arbitral award, some were saying that we lack the enforcement mechanism there, but it seems like we can enforce lawfare and legislation as a defense mechanism for the Philippines in order for us to address such dangerous maneuvers and, of course, the brutal acts coming from China. And we know for a fact that the Philippines is a natural boundary between the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Okay, let's move to the next slide to show you what are the other alternatives that we have. I remembered last week we had the graduation at the National Defense College, and the gold medal awardee from our military student had a thesis on the sea lanes, archipelagic sea lanes. These are some of the identified probable archipelagic sea lanes that we have in the Philippines. In North Luzon, you have the Balintang Channel and Babuyan Channel. Central Philippines would be, of course, the Verde Island Passage, which is also the meta center when it comes to biodiversity in the world. You have Sibuyan Sea, San Bernardino Strait, Mindoro Strait, Tabla Strait, and of course, in southern part or corridor of the Philippines, you have the Sulusi and the Balabac Strait in Palawan. And then, of course, in southern Philippines, of course, you still have the Surigao Strait, Bohol Sea, Basilan Strait, and Cebu Passage. So these are very important in order for us to at least implement these archipelagic sea lanes so that we can have more enforcement when it comes to foreign aggression coming from foreign vessels and aircrafts. Okay, what else I would like to share with you? Can we please move to the next slide? All right. So what's the role of ASEAN, given that, of course, we know for a fact that ASEAN is trying to become the main driver of all the multilateral organizations that we had. As mentioned earlier, you have different mechanisms there, ASEAN and Canada, ASEAN and US, ASEAN and UN, ASEAN and Japan. So maybe you have these 5 claimant countries in the region: the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei. We can include Indonesia there because of the Natuna Island. And of course, the role of multilateralism, that is very important, especially that in ASEAN, we know that it's quite deficit yet as of the moment. And then maybe we could include Singapore and Thailand there as critical observers so that they could offer more alternative ways on how we could conduct more proactive ways on how to resolve some of the maritime disputes in the region. And of course, we know for the fact that the 3 other countries in the region, like Myanmar, Laos, and what's that other one there? Cambodia, have favorites in the region. That's the reason why we have to, in a way, influence them also on how to innovate some of the ASEAN way that we have here in the region. Okay, let's move to the next slide to show you the power of the middle power syndrome. It seems like, of course, ASEAN itself is an emerging middle power, and so there are 6 other countries here that includes the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand that are claimed by other multilateral organizations as middle powers. And we've seen that like-minded countries are also supporting us when it comes to maritime security. Maybe we could, of course, help foster these kind of partnerships, strategic partnerships and alliances because they are friends and they support our causes when it comes to maritime security. Okay, so I guess the last slide that I would like to show to you is, of course, why collective deterrence? We know for a fact that in the region there are a lot of deterrence comes and it is not, of course, definitely we need this in order for us to enhance cooperation with dialogue partners. And we have to do some policy innovations in order for us to at least deter some of the dangerous movements coming from China. And at the end of the day, our goal is to maintain the maritime rules-based order. So I'll end it here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chester Cabalza. All right. Now, may we call on, for your opening speech, Sir Commodore Debesh Lahiri.
Well, thank you, Joyce. Good morning to everyone. Namaste. Disclaimer first, I'm here in my personal capacity as the Executive Director of the National Maritime Foundation, and the views that I'm going to express are entirely personal and do not in any way reflect the views of the Indian government. Having said that and got that out of the way, I will, since I've been given 5 minutes to speak, I'll first lay down 3 points, essential points. One of them which Professor Manith was kind enough to display on screen for you. If you look at the Indo-Pacific and the strategies of various countries, they can broadly be divided into strategies, outlooks, and guidelines. So depending on which country has promulgated what, essentially they are strategies, outlooks, and guidelines. Secondly, insofar as India is concerned, India's it's been a long journey with the ASEAN and a very successful one. Last year, we celebrated 30 years of ASEAN-India partnership, and the partnership is now at the comprehensive strategic level. Thirdly, India's look east was in 1992, Act East was in 2014, which was again alluded to by Professor Manit. But what is more important is Sagar. India's policy is Sagar for the Indo-Pacific and the entire region. It was promulgated in 2015, and it essentially means security and growth for all in the region. The word Sagar in Hindi also translates to ocean. Now, what does it essentially imply? It implies that India believes that a rising tide will lift all boats. And so therefore, it cannot be that one economy doesn't do well and the others prosper. So India looks at peace, prosperity, and progress for the entire region in the Indo-Pacific. And what is India's idea of the Indo-Pacific? Again, very clearly enunciated by our Prime Minister at the 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue, wherein he stated that the Indo-Pacific, insofar as India is concerned, is from the east coast of Africa to the western shores of the Americas. So that is how India looks at the Indo-Pacific. And since this session is focused on role of dialogue partners, and India has been a very important dialogue partner of the ASEAN, there are 2 points that I would like to make. First, the Indian Navy for many years now has been making regular port calls. We've been doing coordinated patrols, exercises, visits with all the ASEAN countries, if not all, majority of the ASEAN countries, in a bilateral manner. It was only in May of this year that from the 2nd to the 8th, we did a joint exercise which was codenamed or named as MX, which is ASEAN-India Maritime Exercise. And it was a huge success. A lot of interoperability issues were addressed, and I'm sure in the years to come, whenever these exercises are held, it will only develop from strength to strength. Secondly, and very importantly, we had a visit from the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, His Excellency Enrique Manalo, to India. And he had it was part of the joint Commission on Bilateral Cooperation between India and Philippines, and it was the 5th such meeting between Mr. Manalo and the Foreign Affairs Minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar. And an important statement, amongst the many statements that were made, there was an important statement which was made which alluded to the dispute between Philippines and China. And I'll just read it out so that it goes exactly insofar as what was stated. What was stated is such: both countries have a shared interest in the free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region, and underlined the need for peaceful settlement of disputes and for adherence to international laws. The next part is very important, especially the UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award on the South China Sea. Now this part, the peaceful settlement of disputes and for adherence to international law, especially the UNCLOS and 2016 Arbitral Award on the South China Sea, is a pronounced shift from the earlier statement of India, wherein the outcome of the award had been recognized. So there's been a pronounced shift from your earlier stand when the award actually came out in 2016 to what was recently stated when both the foreign affairs ministers met in New Delhi from the 27th to the 29th of June. Another part of that joint statement was they also recognized the need for developing countries to coordinate their responses to key issues, which essentially means that all countries on key issues should try and sing from the same hymn sheet so that there's a coordinated response, and the response is conveyed to actors in the region who do not believe in the rule-based order or who intend to act in an aggressive manner, thereby putting the international order at sea, the rules-based order at sea, at risk. Other than that, as a dialogue partner of the ASEAN, we have been promoting several fronts of whether it is non-traditional security threats, whether it is humanitarian aid and disaster relief, whether it is in the field of hydrography, marine scientific research, training and sharing of best practices. So I think these are avenues which can be pursued as a dialogue partner and which will help in building a consensus in this area and addressing this aspect of peaceful resolution of maritime issues in the ASEAN region. So with that, I will keep it here and would be open for more questions during the session which will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commodore Debesh. Now may we hear from Dr. Alma Salvador, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Alma Maria Salvador from the Department of Political Science of Ateneo de Manila. I'd like to look into the ASEAN dialogue partners as an important driver for maritime security cooperation. And I'd like to highlight several points. Number one is the extent to which the ASEAN dialogue partnership arrangement provides for an opportunity to emphasize ASEAN centrality. Now, we speak of ASEAN centrality as a mechanism by which ASEAN, as a middle power entity, it's a collective middle power entity that's capable of creating a more inclusive regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, this is important specifically when we look at the composition of ASEAN as made up of rising middle powers. Now, I've posited my position on middle power ships, specifically on the role of the Philippines in being able to claim a middle power position, being a very important claimant in the West Philippine Sea dispute. In the context of international relations, for instance, and given the changing regional security infrastructure in the South China Sea area, the role of middle powers is important in being able to put forward the voice and avert the so-called new Cold War of bipolar rivalry. And a third way by which we can posit a position of peaceful settlement of dispute is something that is important role that ASEAN centrality can advance. It's also important that writing from what Professor Dindo Manhit earlier stated, that the whole idea of Indo-Pacific construction by ASEAN is also important. So far, in the South China Sea region, given the intensification of US-China rivalry, the concept of Indo-Pacific has been dominated by US, and I would say US construction, and an ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific contributes to the securitization of this outlook of the Indo-Pacific, and it highlights the ability of ASEAN to construct its own definition of what Indo-Pacific should be all about, given the role of middle powers in a more inclusive regional infrastructure. I would also like to look into the regional infrastructure and by which the United States has transformed or has put forward a challenge to ASEAN multilateralism. Now, US emphasis on multilateralism, I would say, is a challenge to the multilateralism that ASEAN has painstakingly put forward, even given their own set of challenges. But the US focus on multilateralism now, which is greatly changing and reshaping the dynamic in the region, is considerably affecting ASEAN centrality. And therefore, I would say that a construction of the Indo-Pacific outlook, or I'm sorry, the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook is important in the securitizing and de-risking tensions that has been put forward by an intensified US-China rivalry. Now, in the last ASEAN summit, ASEAN Dialogue Partnership Arrangement has also contributed to the elevation of our relations with our dialogue partners to a comprehensive strategic partnership level. Now, this is important because with a more comprehensive strategic partnership, we've widened the scope of maritime security. So this is also the contribution of ASEAN in de-risking and the securitizing maritime security to include non-traditional security aspects, such as, for instance, counterterrorism, cyber crime, and human trafficking. It allows these issues to cross, to create some kind of cross-pillar synergies, allowing us to contribute and broaden the scope of our conversation away from a more geopolitical focus on maritime security towards focus on confidence building in areas where we can collaborate with partners, deepen our spoke-to-spoke relations, and again, advance claim to middle powership role of ASEAN in this changing Indo-Pacific region. I would also like to look into the focus on economic collaboration between ASEAN and its partners. With economic collaboration, what is happening now is we allow for a de-sinification. So with the Indo-Pacific dynamic now renders greater interdependency on the part of ASEAN member states on China, and with an expanded economic collaboration between ASEAN and its dialogue partners, we provide for more opportunities for reducing the vulnerability and economic dependency of ASEAN member states on China. With economic collaboration, we are also putting forward or advancing greater multipolarity and a shift from the emerging bipolarity or the new Cold War arrangement towards a more multipolar arrangement is more conducive to peacemaking in the region. And of course, I'd like to be able to emphasize that with the comprehensive security partnership between ASEAN and our dialogue partners, we are able to broaden the scope of maritime security. This is something that is emphasized in the ASEAN Maritime Outlook, which is also aligned with the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook. Now, this contributes to several other mechanisms of ASEAN that is very much connected to the protection of our maritime domain and our maritime region, not excluding the need for us to continue with a code of conduct negotiation, even if it is a way by which China protracts or apply a protracted way of controlling or asserting its hegemonic power in the region. But the code of conduct is one way by which the ASEAN as a middle power entity is able to balance the power in this very tenuous Indo-Pacific power dynamic. But we need to be wary that the maritime security cooperation is yet to be developed, because a lot that is included in the ASEAN Maritime Outlook does not have a practical value. It is not a blueprint. It does not contain specific strategies. So it's important for ASEAN with its dialogue partners to be able to invest its resources to be able to deepen and operationalize what this evolving maritime security cooperation should be beyond the geopolitical turn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alma Salvador. Next, Ms. Daniela Braun.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me. I will talk a little bit about Germany's security engagement with the region, and I would like to share with you two main observations which result in somehow in an ambiguous picture when it comes to Germany's Indo-Pacific security engagement. First, also a brief disclaimer. As you all know, Germany is not an Indo-Pacific country, and in contrast to other European nations like UK and France, Germany has no territorial holdings in the Indo-Pacific. However, given the tremendous increase of geostrategic and geoeconomic importance of the region in recent years, Germany has also responded with its own Indo-Pacific guidelines. They were released in 2020, and we saw them also in the map of Prof. Dindo in the beginning. The main focus of Germany's Indo-Pacific guidelines is the geographic and thematic diversification of relations with the region. And German officials always stress that the guidelines are meant to be inclusive and not directed against any nation. Germany's interest in the Indo-Pacific are on the one hand heavily economic, so about 20% of its total trade in goods is with countries of the region, but also on the other hand, Germany's interests are based on the fundamental assumption that developments in this dynamic region will have a decisive influence on the future of the international rules-based order on which Germany's security and prosperity depends. And this brings me to my first main observation I would like to share with you. Germany's security footstep in the region is increasing, which is depicted by multiple initiatives. I think the first most visible outcome I would like to mention was the tour of a German frigate, Bayern, through the Indian and the Pacific Ocean from August 2021 to February 2022. During the tour, the frigate concluded multiple port calls in the region, bilateral consultations, but also participated in smaller exercises with partners of the region along the sea routes. The objectives of the tour were to revive Germany's relationships in the region, provide an impetus for, of course, security, military, and also diplomatic consultations, but also to contribute to upholding international law in this part of the world. It was the first German naval ship after 20 years, and it was also a serious tour de force for the German Navy, given the international commitments, but also the very limited resources of the German Navy. Some have criticized the tour as half-hearted because German officials constantly stated that the trip of the Bayern was not directed against any nation, and the deployment also consciously avoided transitioning any disputed sea routes. Our defense minister, Boris Pistorius, announced during this year's Shangri-La dialogue that in 2024, Germany will send 2 ships to the region, 1 frigate and 1 supply ship. And I think it will be very interesting to see which route the ships will take, also if they may transition any disputed areas and which countries they might visit and which countries they won't visit. Another initiative was that the German Luftwaffe deployed for the first time combat aircraft to Australia to participate in the multilateral Pitch Black air combat exercise in September 2022. Currently, Germany is also applying to become an observer in the ADMM+, so in the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. And being here in Manila, I think it's also worth mentioning that currently Germany is working together with the Philippine Coast Guard to enhance their surveillance capabilities. They are donating drones and they are training the Philippine Coast Guard how to use them. Admittedly, this is a very limited number of drones, but I think it's worth mentioning here. Having said that, Germany's security footstep in the region is increasing, which I personally think is a very good thing, we have to keep in mind that Germany is currently undergoing a fundamental shift in its foreign and security policy since February 24, 2022. The so-called Zeitenwende, which can be translated as change of an era, as a result of Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine, has fostered Germany's ambition to assume a leading military role in Europe and significantly step up its defense spending. But what does the war in Europe and the implications thereof mean for Germany's engagement in the Indo-Pacific? I believe the answer to this question is not that easy. On the one hand, if you listen to German and European officials, they stress that the security of the regions are linked and interconnected, which I absolutely agree with. And in addition, I think the war in Europe has also stressed the need to diversify and de-risk relationships, and I think the Indo-Pacific countries will benefit from this. But on the other hand, I think it cannot be ignored that the war in Europe is taking away a lot of resources and attention away from this region for countries like Germany. So, for example, this summer, the German federal government released for the first time ever a comprehensive national security strategy. And if you look at this document, which has 74 pages, the Indo-Pacific is only mentioned once very briefly. And this brings me to my second main observation. So even though the role of Germany, the security role, is increasing, the role will remain a very modest one for the time being. So I would like to conclude, even though Germany's security footstep in the Indo-Pacific is increasing, Berlin has neither the ambition nor the military capabilities to become a main security provider to this region. Irrespective of this, I believe Germany can and should use other resources and contribute to maritime security as well as a rules-based order, which our security, Germany's security and prosperity is highly depending on. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Daniela Braun. And may we also call on Dr. Prashant Parameswaran to deliver his opening statement.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll keep my remarks brief because I think a lot of the sort of previous remarks have already touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to do, which is a great thing. I will sort of focus my remarks largely around on the issue of maritime security and ASEAN and the role of dialogue partners by looking at what I sort of term the 4 Ps, process, peace, prosperity, and people, which are kind of 4 lenses through we can look at sort of how these issues and concepts relate to maritime security and the role of ASEAN and dialogue partners. And I think with each of these, we can see opportunities, but we can also see challenges in that respect. I think with respect to process, I think what we saw come out of the recent round of ASEAN Summitry was, I think, a clear recognition by Indonesia as the chair this year that there are several issues structurally that need to be worked on within ASEAN, whether it's establishing very clearly, what is the main regional grouping to Professor Dinho Manhit's point about ASEAN and some of its challenges. What is the sort of principal organization within ASEAN that's going to work on these issues? Is it the ASEAN Maritime Forum? Is it the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum? We're seeing a little bit of indication of a little bit of clarity in that respect. We also saw the publication of the inaugural ASEAN Maritime Outlook, which is a significant development, and I think a very sort of practical notion that this is not something that's going to be issued annually, but every few years. Hopefully this continues because I think it's a good way to take stock as to what ASEAN is doing well, but also the areas in which ASEAN needs to improve in that respect as well. So I think in terms of process, there was a very clear recognition both of the opportunities, but also the challenges for ASEAN moving forward in that regard. I also think if you look carefully at the statements that were issued by the United States, by Canada, by some of the other like-minded partners, you did see very consistent language across the board about upholding freedom of navigation, references to not just UNCLOS, but also ICAO, IMO, and a lot of international and regional organizations, which I think is important for us to keep the focus on international law in a very coordinated fashion to make sure that that's something which unites like-minded countries when other countries, like, for example, China, are not adhering to these international law and sort of regulations. So that's on process. I think secondly, on peace, we are also seeing incremental inroads with respect to ASEAN and some of its dialogue partners. I have written in the past that it is pretty striking that the first time that ASEAN held a naval exercise between its countries, an official sort of AMNEX, was only in 2017, and that was hosted by Thailand. And so since then, including the most recent iteration that was hosted by the Philippines, ASEAN's begun to be a little bit more serious about how it's holding these. I do think that that's important. We're going to see another exercise within a few days, actually, that ASEAN is hosting. Even though it's not in the waters close to the South China Sea, as Indonesia may have wanted it to be, or announced it to be, I think that's something that's really important to kind of keep the focus on confidence building and capability management. We are also seeing other actors like the United States step in, not just with respect to naval capabilities, but also the role of the Coast Guard, including what we've seen from the Quad in the very unwieldy acronym of the IPMDA, the Indo-Pacific Notion and Initiative for Maritime Domain Awareness, IPMDA. And that's been a little bit slow to get off the ground, but it is good that we are seeing these capability sort of enhancement mechanisms take root in the region. So that's on peace. I think on prosperity and people, I mean, these are two dimensions that, I think it's important to look at maritime security from the prism of challenges. But I also think that these challenges are more than just sort of from a narrow prism of security. A couple of the other panelists mentioned non-traditional security. And these are very important notions for us to sort of keep in mind. I think it was significant that ASEAN issued a document on the blue economy, which is a very sort of broad notion around fisheries, aquaculture, ecotourism, and so on and so forth. But I think it is important because when you look at the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, maritime cooperation is mentioned there as a priority, but maritime cooperation is mentioned as a cross-cutting endeavor. So that's looking at security, but it's also looking at economics, it's also looking at the environment, it's looking at sustainable development goals, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really important that ASEAN issued that document. Incidentally, that document is very straightforward and clear in terms of the fact that, and I'll quote from the document, ASEAN still lacks the concept of value creation, inclusiveness, and sustainability aspects to support the sustainability development goals. So I think it's pretty clear where the challenges are in terms of the blue economy, but I do think it's a useful prism to view it from the perspective of prosperity. The other point I'll quickly mention, maritime connectivity is also a very significant issue within ASEAN or lack thereof. One of the projects that we've seen issued that have come out in the recent statements, there are about 58 projects within the annex of the ASEAN documents that were issued from Indonesia with respect to the epicentrum of growth. And incidentally, one of the big priorities of the Jokowi administration is looking at connectivity and infrastructure. One of the projects actually talks about Indonesia and France and maritime cooperation in terms of green infrastructure and resilient supply chains. And I think looking at the maritime domain as being a sector where it's cross-cutting and you can look at not just economics, but also supply chains and the environment, is going to be really important because that is an important sphere for ASEAN to focus on. And then lastly, I'll just quickly conclude on the people aspect, which is the fourth P. I think training and understanding is a really important component of that. I think we saw a number of announcements. Unfortunately, U.S. President Joe Biden was not able to attend the ASEAN summit in Indonesia himself, but we did see the U.S. make announcements on, one announcement that I think is particularly important is an investment that's going to be annually and sort of 10 million each year for cultivating the next generation of defense leaders in the region, which the United States is going to formalize next year. And also the opening of a U.S. ASEAN Center here in Washington, D.C., which I think, helping build these maritime connectivities that are about people as much as they are about concepts and issues and vessels in the sea, I think is really important. And then finally, I'll just note the other aspect of people that I think is really important is when we talk about the welfare of individuals at sea, we're also talking about fishermen, we are also talking about seafarers. We're also talking about the rights of people. And I think that's going to be really important to address. Obviously, there are many countries that will have a say in that. But the Philippines is, the world's largest seafaring supplying country in the world, and it's going to have a very important role in that, even as we're talking about the other issues like illegal fishing, transnational threats, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. The challenges are also well known, as we've talked about on issues like the South China Sea, for example, and other maritime disputes within Southeast Asian countries that also need to be worked out over time. So the challenges are there, but I also think there are opportunities across all of these 4 Ps that I outlined. And I think the role of dialogue partners and the notion of the like-minded is going to continue to be a very important thread throughout maritime security as we address it across the region. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Prashant Parameswaran. All right, quite insightful opening statements from our speakers today. We definitely have a lot to unpack in our discussion this morning. So I would like to start with a discussion of the Code of Conduct. I think it was Dr. Alma who mentioned it earlier also. As we know, the Philippines recently hosted the latest round of negotiations for a Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And President Bongbong Marcos Jr. said that there have been some progress in the negotiations for the Code of Conduct. But it was also him who said that the goal of making the South China Sea an area of peace and stability is still distant amid unresolved territorial disputes. I think it was also mentioned by Sir Dindo in his opening statement earlier. So to all our speakers, so what do you think are the challenges in finalizing such a document? Dr. Alma, would you like to start?
Well, I think one of the major challenges for finalizing a code of conduct is the asymmetrical relations between China and the ASEAN. That's number one. And then number two, of course, would be the divergent paths by which ASEAN presents itself when negotiating with China. So what we're experiencing is whenever there are negotiations of the Code of Conduct, we have there a competition between individual ASEAN member state interests and collective ASEAN member interests. That's one. And at another level, it will be the divergent interests between the littoral states and the land-based states. So those are major challenges, not to mention the fact that the approach taken by China as an asymmetrical power is, I would say, unfortunately, rather duplicitous, because we do not know the extent to which the underlying motives behind China's desire to negotiate with ASEAN are definitely unclear, and we also need to disaggregate the voices that underpin, for instance, what seems to be an official China policy. So who is really negotiating with ASEAN? Who is this? The Communist Party? Is this one other Xi Jinping? Is it other branches of the Chinese government? So those are major challenges so far. And of course, I think what the last point that I'd like to raise is, of course, the dependency that there is between the other tier of ASEAN, and I'm looking at Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and their dependency on China, China being a major trading partner. And as a result, this dependency that is formed in so far as the relationship between China and this tier of ASEAN, I would say contributes to this Indo-Pacific dynamic, or this South China Sea dynamic, where there seems to be no other recourse but for ASEAN member states to perpetuate this bipolar arrangement. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, for me, hello. Yeah. Yes, good. Well, for me, when we talk about the code of conduct, it's a written behavior, right? But it seems like the giant neighbor does not behave properly. So how can we deal with that code of conduct if we don't leverage on the common ground when it comes to common behaviors of claimant countries? That's the reason why it took time for us to at least have a leverage or a common ground to come up with a complete code of conduct in the region. But I guess in solving this elusive code of conduct that we have in the region is perhaps more openness in terms of what do we want as a region. And secondly, it should also involve different stakeholders and institutions where, of course, cooperation, diplomacy will work. So those are some of the things that I have in mind.
Yeah, my point of being a dialogue partner is that, the essential reason for the disputes are the non-recognition of the maritime delimitation boundaries of the various littorals that are there in this region. And unless and until that is resolved, the very definition, it is being called the South China Sea Code of Conduct. So why not, if you're going to recognize West Philippine Seas, if you're going to recognize the seas east of Vietnam, the Sea of Japan, then how does one, unless and until the EEZs and the continental shelf claims of each of the littorals are recognized and mutually or accepted in this region, I think the geographical definition of where it is going to be enforced or apply is the first point. It's going to be a challenge. Secondly, if you look at the code of conduct and the discussions that have been held so far, including the first reading and the recent reading, there has been no reference to the UNCLOS. Or rather, it is silent on the UNCLOS, if not no reference. Now, UNCLOS is the guiding constitution of the seas, and it has been recognized and countries have ratified. And it is not a couple of countries that have ratified. It is almost, if I'm not mistaken, 161 countries which have ratified the UNCLOS. There is no reference to that. Thirdly, it hints at non-interference of partners, dialogue partners, who have an interest in the region, who are stakeholders, as some of the panelists mentioned. In this, it looks like a bilateral between ASEAN and China, which is not really going to help, because had it been resolved by now, the issue wouldn't have cropped up. So these are the 3 points that I would like to make, and I would leave it there.
Same question also for Daniela and Prashant, but I would just like to add as well, because aside from considering these challenges, there are also statements that the goal really is for the early conclusion of the creation of the Code of Conduct, and that it should be in accordance with, according to at least President Marcos Jr., it should be in accordance with international law, including the 1982 UNCLOS, as he said, Commodore. And Indonesian leaders said that the Code of Conduct should also be effective, substantive, and actionable. Considering all these, do you think, Prashant and Daniela, that these are doable? Is an early conclusion doable? Is a Code of Conduct that is effective, substantive, actionable, and also in accordance with international law doable? Prashant, would you like to start?
Sure.
Answer first? Okay.
I agree with much of what's been said already. I would just go back to Dr. Alma's point about asymmetry, which I think is really important. I think the notion of an asymmetric relationship is that what you would hope is that the bigger power, there is some sort of deference and acknowledgement of the vast asymmetry of capabilities from the smaller country to the bigger country, but there also needs to be an acknowledgement of autonomy given by the bigger country to the smaller country in respect for sovereignty and rights. And we are not seeing that coming from China. And until we see that, whether or not we have a code of conduct or not, that, to my mind, is less important. Because remember, we had decades of negotiations over the Declaration of Conduct. And the Declaration of Conduct has already been violated several times. So what's to say that the Code of Conduct, even though it is, if it comes into fruition, wouldn't be violated, which leads to the second point, which is the asymmetry of capabilities that Southeast Asian states have relative to China. So the need to invest in maritime capabilities, Coast Guard, and so on and so forth to ensure that each country, international law, I think, is a continued guiding post and it needs to be followed, and each country needs to follow that. But I also think there needs to be an ability to enforce international law by each country for its own sake. Relying on allies and partners is important, of course, but I think until you have sort of those two realities come to the fore, what we will continue to have is a big gap between what is written on paper and what is actually happening on the water, which is what we are seeing right now. And I think that's the gap that really needs to be bridged.
Daniela?
Yes, thank you. Maybe very brief from a German standpoint. The negotiations of the Code of Conduct are also mentioned in the German Indo-Pacific guidelines, and Germany is supportive of the negotiations. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, sorry. So Germany is supportive of the negotiations, and it's mentioned that they are, should be legally binding, whatever that means, and I think this is of course a major challenge, as it was mentioned before. What are the mechanisms in place if countries are not following it? And the second point, Germany as a strong supporter of the rules-based order is very much in favor for that this code of conduct will be definitely on the basis of the of UNCLOS. So I think there are major challenges, but I think also the negotiations itself are already a good thing to keep up the dialogue and addressing these challenges. So I think that's probably also something very beneficial.
Thank you. You mentioned legally binding. Do you think it's possible to have a code of conduct that has enforcement mechanisms? And can they be enforceable given that what Prashant said, that China keeps on violating agreements, the declaration of conduct, or what do you think, Chester?
Yeah, that's the reason why in my presentation earlier, there's a missing link that we've seen from the part of the Philippines, given that, of course, we won an arbitral award in 2016, and then you have the archipelagic doctrine principle that is part of the UNCLOS law already. But I guess domestic laws through legislation and lawfare would also simplify things, because definitely when we won that award, it was a agreement between two parties, because we filed a case against China. But it seems like China didn't accept it as it is. So that became a question there in that equation. So perhaps the question of enforcement is something that we have to look at, given that, of course, there are innovative ways on how to do it through diplomacy, perhaps. That's the reason why we are here, to talk about multilateralism, unilateralism, perhaps bilateralism also will work. So those are some of the things that we can look at.
Dr. Alma, would you like that?
Certainly. Well, rule enforcement is different, and it's difficult to attain in an international regime such as a code of conduct. That's number one. Again, what we are confronted here is a divergence by which we would like to enforce rules of international law. And for instance, regional rules such as the ASEAN Way, which is basically based on non-intervention. So I would say that enforcement would largely rely on mutual trust, reciprocity, and confidence building, and definitely different from the way we enforce the rules at the domestic level.
Well, my take is what I would just reiterate what my fellow panelists said, that the reason that we are all here is because a actor or a country is not adhering to what is could be or should be legally binding. Now, if you look at the PCA award of 2016, which was clearly in the favor of the Philippines, not only did China not participate in the proceedings, but at the same time, for every submission that was made by the Philippines to the PCA, they had their own statements coming up thereafter, but in an unofficial manner. But they refused to participate in the arbitration proceedings per se. That speaks a lot about their whole attitude. Now, if you take a converse view and see what happened between India and Bangladesh, we also had a maritime delimitation issue, a boundary issue. We also went to the PCA. The PCA ruled in favor of Bangladesh, and India has accepted it or what? If you look at Vietnam and Indonesia, they also had a maritime boundary issue, but they bilaterally resolved it. So it is important that the country has the character and the political will to accept what is internationally awarded. Now, if a country is not going to do that, and the COC is actually very silent on anything binding. The COC does not talk of any binding instrument. So if an actor like China, which refuses to abide by what has been awarded by the UNCLOS, or as per the UNCLOS by the PCA, I really can't see them agreeing to what in the future, if the COC, somebody mentioned the DOC is already in place. Hopefully the COC will come in place someday. But how do you plan to enforce it? So I personally don't see it happening. And so therefore this issue, whether it is going to be legally binding or no, to my mind, if they are not obeying the PCA award, or for that matter, something like that, I don't see it happening through the COC. That's my take on it.
You don't see the COC, even if we finish it, being enforceable?
No,
you all agree?
Yes, with respect to what is already playing out. History is a very clear indicator at most times, if not all, of what the future behavior is going to be. It may not, history may not tell you everything that is going to happen in the future. Most of the times, history repeats itself.
You want to add, Doctor?
Well, the enforcement of regional-based rules largely depends on your domestic law enforcement capabilities and the political will to be able to enforce these rules. And then if we look at, for instance, the ability of the Philippines or the capability of the Philippines to be able to enforce its own set of maritime rules at the regional and at the international level, we would likely enter into a discussion on its capability to put forward a credible defense, to be able to protect its boundaries, its maritime zones. So I think that comes first and foremost before a regional and collective enforcement of rules that would govern the conduct and the use of the maritime resources and the observance of UNCLOS as would apply in our region.
All right, I actually have more follow-up questions, but I would like to give this time to our audience, to our participants here in the venue. Do you have questions? Do you want to ask? Okay, Captain KK.
Good morning. It was a wonderful panel, particularly with regard to ASEAN and the interactions with China. I really like the discussion on the COC. My question is to the first panelist, and this is in background of what Professor Manhet said with regard to the Southeast Asia survey report, that 60.7% respondents felt that the ASEAN was getting greatly disunited on various issues. One of the main factors is that COC itself is a main cause underlying the so-called disunity, wherein you also came up with a slide which showed 5 plus 2 plus 3, deconstruct, if I can call it. Yeah. So I was of the firm view that there are 4 subgroups in the ASEAN, particularly divided over the views or perspectives on COC. But thankfully you have put them into 3. From my talks with various interlocutors in Singapore also, I find there is a lot of differences between the ASEAN, between Indonesia and Singapore on the various provisions of AOIP itself. And even regarding the ownership of the AOIP and a little bit of a variation of AOIP. So if though with these kind of differences lying between the various ASEAN nations. How do you actually plan to tackle the single challenge, single revisionist challenge in the area? And one small question to Dr. Amor. With $800+ billion trade with China and ASEAN countries, the economic designification, I don't know how practical is it or how real it can be done. We have seen how the European Union can still not get out of the dependence, energy dependence and other dependence from Russia, despite 2 years of war. Thank you.
All right, I'll answer the first question there. The role of ASEAN is basically transitioning right now in the world affairs, given that, of course, there's so much attention to the region. And it could be possible that in the coming decades, ASEAN would play such a major role just like the European Union is doing right now because of the Indo-Pacific concept and, of course, the strategies coming from the major powers. But how do we solve the problem like ASEAN, given that, of course, it's divided, it's the cockpit of bipolar world between the US and China, and definitely it's an emerging market. And what we see in the region is hedging, de-risking, balancing act, and so on. And I think this is the best time for us to understand and perhaps fathom and reflect what does ASEAN want, basically. If we become the main driver of the Indo-Pacific, then at least we have to have a common culture on how to resolve our own internal problems as a region. Because, of course, it's not only maritime security or the South China Sea that is the problem in Southeast Asia. We have Myanmar problem also on human rights abuses. So there are a lot of multiplex problems in the region. As a region which is the most heterogeneous region in the world, culturally speaking, and we are the meta center of the ecological system in the world, plus a cockpit of superpowers economically and a strategic battlefield of competing powers. Then how do we solve this as ASEAN? It's really complex. There's no definite answer as of now, but as we go on, we'll try to reflect what could be done and what would be our strengths for the future. And I deem and I have that high hopes that ASEAN would lead and, of course, give us more alternative options for the Indo-Pacific region. Okay.
We cannot really de-signify economically, at the level of ASEAN. It will really be hard to do that because we have a huge dependency on the ASEAN market. Even Japan has dependency, China is an important trading partner of Japan. China is also an important trading partner of the United States. But I think what we can do if we are to pursue a path of de-risking and the securitizing is to diversify our economic partners so that we can, for instance, given our experience in the pandemic where our supply chain, of course, was largely affected because of our dependency on the Chinese market, we can take this path of being able to value more and deepen our relations with our dialogue partners, and which is why we've looked into moving towards the level of the comprehensive strategic level of partnership with our dialogue partners so that we could deepen our relationship with them. We could look at, for instance, and enhance our relationship with our non-traditional partners, including, for instance, Australia. Australia has yet to, I would say, operationalize our economic relations with members of ASEAN. We need to be able to consider also I would say, two-tier movement on the part of the members of the littoral states in ASEAN and the land-based states. I think we need to be able to re-examine the consensus mode of decision-making from amongst the ASEAN so that we can not only deal with China as an economic entity, but to deal with China as a security as a security entity, as a security threat. And both to look into the ways by which we can address the geopolitical issues as an emerging middle power in the region, if that's the role of ASEAN.
Do we have any more questions from our participants? Any more questions? All right. Okay, if you don't have a question, I'll ask. Oh, hold on. Oh, there. Okay, Miss Malu Bartolome.
I'm just wondering if you guys can comment on what's happening in the internal politics now in China, because there's some sort of reshuffling in the Politburo, including the foreign ministry. Thank you.
You're smiling, Commodore. You want to say something?
I'm smiling because I don't want to say anything. No, I am not really a student of Chinese internal politics. But yes, the dissension that is crept in, I would say the dissension was there, but it is more evident since just before the 20th Congress, a lot of things were seen. Banners and holdings, which otherwise wouldn't have been seen, were seen. They were reported in the media extensively. And over a period of time, we also saw during the Congress, one very senior leader, the way he was escorted out or shepherded out of the meeting. That spoke a lot about what is happening there. Thereafter, of course, as you mentioned, the foreign minister's appointment and subsequent, change in the appointment. So these are all issues which are clearly indicative of large-scale dissension within. But I won't be able to comment further because I'm not really a student of internal politics.
Well, definitely, internal politics in China has an impact in the region, basically because especially that China is trying to flex their foreign policy. And in their foreign policy, it also denotes their management on their South China Sea policy. And definitely, there are issues that cannot be said publicly, but I guess what is important there, reshuffling happens because China wants to strengthen its power projection in the world. Given that, of course, given that, of course, you have dwindling economy in the region of China, plus aging population, and mismanagement of the COVID-19. So the complexity would definitely arise, given that, of course, it was not properly addressed by their foreign policy.
Dr.
Can I just...
Okay, go ahead, Prashant.
Just
Go ahead,
quickly,
Prashant.
I just wanted to add to the great comments already. I mean, just to build on what's been said already. I think it tells me sort of two things. I think one, we have to be very careful, even as we acknowledge China's great capabilities militarily. China is not 10 feet tall. There's a lot of issues, problems, and challenges within the Chinese system. A lot of it we don't hear about. I think in contrast, in the American system, we hear everything that's going on that's problematic about the United States. But I think in authoritarian systems, they have politics too. We just don't often hear about it, but it comes out in terms of President Xi not attending a particular meeting, or the change in foreign minister that goes missing for a few weeks. And his name is on the website, not on the website, back on the website. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. I think also the second point is China is not a constant. I mean, the whole sort of story about China for centuries is, sort of a story about a polity that is united, and when it becomes too centralized, it then becomes divided, and authority then decentralizes again, and then it goes back to centralization. And I think the big dynamic we're seeing under President Xi is an over-centralization of power within China in his hands. And usually, I can't say for sure what's going to happen in the future, I'm not trying to predict anything, but usually what we see in China historically is that there's a pattern of decentralization, because that's usually not how authority is sustained for decades within the country. So in terms of what that means for China's foreign policy, I think we go back and forth sort of saying, if China's too internally focused, is it going to be more assertive because it's trying to look for excuses outwards, or is it going to be less assertive because it's going to be so focused internally? But I think I would spend less time sort of worrying about what China will do and sort of more invested in what can the international community and like-minded states do, irrespective of what China does, to make sure that capabilities are enhanced, that international law is shored up, and that individual interests are actually being protected, including sovereignty. Because as I said, China is a moving target, and China is not 10 feet tall.
All right. Speaking of what, okay, go ahead, sir.
I just have a comment too, along the lines of what he was saying. That's true. Why are we staying within the China framework? We should develop our own framework and let China dialogue within that framework, whether or not they agree. But let's not go into their framework. That's one. Second, in listening to all the discussion, all the points made, people forget that in a market economy, and that's what we have, is the private sector. And for me, the best model is what has happened now in Vietnam with the visit of President Biden, that you can see that there is the political, military defense side, which the Vietnamese are not yet ready to accept, except the political side. But they're ready to accept the economic. And you can see that what Biden has done is he's encouraging the American companies moving out of China to go to Vietnam. And that's what should happen also with the Philippines. We are right now only being used as a political military defense country. But they've forgotten the economic. We have forgotten the economic. And remember, why I say that thing about the Americans is that private sector, the economic dynamism, those companies, that's one of the reasons why the Americans could not really move too much against China, because you have Apple in there, you have all the semiconductor companies, etc. So that should be also considered in all these discussions. How do you bring the private sector in? Now, in centralized economy, it's the state that runs it, but not in a market economy.
Anyone who'd like to answer? Chester?
Well, trying to be frank and honest, is the Philippines viable for economic regime, given that, of course, we try to diversify our economy starting from becoming an agricultural country, and now Vietnam and Thailand became the rock star when it comes to agriculture. We tried to diversify in such a way that maybe industrialization and services would be an answer, but it seems like we were not successful in that, maybe because our political system is not adaptive to the economic market that we have. That's the reason why we try to be more protective, and maybe because of the current economic system that we have in the Philippines, foreign investors are afraid to invest with us, unlike in Vietnam or perhaps Indonesia, where the economic system works because the government is more centralized, and like here it's polarized because of the different interests of our politicians. We have to wake up to the reality that the Philippines is sui generis. It's a different animal in its own compared to our neighbors. We may be competitive in terms of the talent of our people, but when it comes to welcoming foreign investments and to the kind of economic system that we have, we are not yet open to the world economy as it is. That's how I see it, basically. Right.
I agree with everything you say. We know that. So what are we going to do about it? We keep hearing the same problem.
Okay,
and we don't need a solution right now. But I just want to put it as food for thought.
Yeah. One solution that I'm seeing right now, since yesterday until Saturday, we are having a summit together with Filipino nuclear scientists and environmental impact experts, with me included. Right now, we're holding it. And we're trying to open up with our energy security, which would be one of the main investments that we could offer as an economy to the region. And I think even if the president is concurrently the Secretary of Agriculture, the birthday wish is at least to upskill agriculture, and I know that agriculture is one of the biggest failures that we had in our country. So I just like to answer one of about the problem on the China economy. I think I was told by my Chinese friends that whenever Chinese revolt or there are transitions in their internal politics, is because they are dissatisfied with their economy. So perhaps the mere fact that we are seeing some rigodon in their internal politics means that the Chinese people are dissatisfied with their economy. All right.
Commodore, you have something to say?
Yeah, 3 points. One, there are two contrasting realities. One is the economic enmeshment. I use the word enmeshment with China. Whether it is the US, whether it is Japan, whether it is ASEAN as a collective, whether it is the EU as a collective, even for that matter, India, the economic enmeshment with China is extremely high. And therefore, it will take some time to wean away, even if you have to move the manufacturing setup from to an outside country. Any country, I'm not getting specific here. Second is the fact that we are all witness to is the disruption in the global supply chains for two reasons. One, the pandemic, which hopefully is behind us. Second is the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Food, fertilizer, and fuel, three main commodities have been severely affected. And therefore, there is an increasing reliance on regional supply chains. Every country is now thinking of a regional supply chain. Somebody may use the word near-shoring, any terminologies can be used as convenient. But every country is thinking of a regional supply chain so that the disruption is minimal. So that is a very clear indicator that, that is the second point. The third point is if media reports are to be believed, if reports coming from within China are to be believed, there is an economic downturn. And the real estate market is what is being reported upon extensively. It has almost crumbled in a way, and therefore what kind of follow-on effects is going to happen. There are also reports of food insecurity which are likely to happen, and so these challenges are there within the economy, though of course as with most other aspects with respect to the country, things are not really clear on the outside. So unless you have some very reliable inputs, one can't really comment on it. But that is what is available in the open source. So I just wanted to make these 3 points with respect to the economic state of affairs. Thanks.
Since we've been talking about, we have one more question. I think we can, get one last question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Joshua, a resident fellow from the IDSC. So we've been hearing points about minilateralism. I have two twin questions, actually. Should we push for minilateralism? What do we make of countries like, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, which insist on not pinching China too much, since we value ASEAN centrality? And my second question would be, does minilateralism actually diminish or creatively flourish ASEAN centrality?
It's working now. Okay. We can go down to non-traditional, or if not to other fronts of diplomacy. I remember when the NDCP MNSA students, we went around Southeast Asia. And we remembered when we went to Cambodia or perhaps in Laos, they were saying that they are very thankful to the Filipino diplomats, because, especially to the DFA, because they trained Lao diplomats or Cambodian diplomats. So in a way, we can pave way for some other alternative ways, not on the high-risk, high-level issues, security issues, but we can go down to other forms of cooperation, be it agriculture perhaps, or in diplomacy. There's now the museum diplomacy, art diplomacy. You can do a lot of stuff there. But ultimately, let's try to work on multilateralism, because I guess since ASEAN is quite polarized, divided as of now, and of course the ASEAN way says that everyone should agree with it. And not all of the maritime security issues are the concern of the member states of ASEAN. Perhaps multilateralism can work in such a way that there should be agreement coming from those or common interest coming from those claimant countries. And then if it works, then perhaps we can influence some other ASEAN members so that at least we can have a more conducive way of our tradition in increasing the ASEAN way. That's how I see it.
Dr. Alma, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I do agree with you that minilaterals can actually support multilateralism. So if minilateralism would is being undertaken in the context of what Professor Dindaman had earlier said, that the notion of like-minded states working together, or in the context of, for instance, Professor Renato de Castro's notion of spoke-to-spoke, enhancing spoke-to-spoke relations, as opposed to just emphasizing hub and spoke relations, the traditional arrangement by which the United States deals with its allies. I think I would go for that. Yeah.
All right, we'll accept one more question, and then after which we'll have the next panel, and maybe those who still have questions, you can ask our next speakers, okay? So we'll have Carmela Fonbuena of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism.
There was a strong opinion about whether or not the ASEAN COC would be binding to China. I'm very curious about the opinion of our speakers about having a COC that only the ASEAN members would follow. I mean, what's the value to that? That establish a COC that at least the ASEAN as a group could start following, and perhaps later other countries could be asked to follow it also. This is something that I've heard from other speakers before, so I was interested what the speakers think about that.
Maybe we can start with Prashant.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think effectively what we're seeing is this sort of already happening, as you kind of hinted, which is Southeast Asian countries have some existing disputes between themselves, or they have misalignments of certain positions, and they're all kind of working to narrow those issues on a bilateral basis. And so even if China does not agree to that, effectively there's a narrowing of disputes that are happening with Southeast Asian countries themselves. I think what you would hope for actually is some of the more, sort of less lower hanging fruit that we were talking about a few years ago. Like, for example, having a designated ASEAN claimants working group that would meet regularly and issue its own statements relative to what ASEAN is doing as a collective grouping. Now, the last time that was tried, it didn't actually work, and it didn't last very long. But to my mind, there are sort of more tangible and practical ways that we could move forward with minilateralism that can actually support multilateralism in its own sake. I mean, I think often when we talk about multilateralism or minilateralism, we kind of get stuck sometimes, to my mind, as to what approach is better. I think sometimes it's better to just start with the problem and see what format better lends itself to solving the problem. So if it's South China Sea and you're having a problem with code of conduct with ASEAN as a grouping, maybe as you said in your question, you sort of focus on narrowing the disputes and kind of meet and issue statements as a collective working group. And if ASEAN can come up with a statement in and of itself, great. And it might be a more basic statement, but there can be multiple layers of consensus that are reached between the groupings. I just wanted to comment on the broader question that was asked earlier on minilateralism and sort of ASEAN as a grouping and Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. I mean, I think that kind of is where a lot of this started, because ASEAN essentially doubled in size after the end of the Cold War, and also then decided that it was going to want to be sort of central in the regional architecture and convene these meetings, but it never actually changed its decision-making processes. It still operated by consensus. So if you have a more diverse body and you're going to do more things, and you're still operating by the same decision-making structures, you're naturally going to have a problem. So unless we see those mechanisms addressed, which are intrinsically quite difficult to address within ASEAN, you're still going to see that because it's a structural problem. It's not a perceptual problem. It's not who is chairing ASEAN. It has to do with the structures and the decision-making processes of those institutions. And part of that you can address to that. But also I would say I wouldn't say in defense of Laos, Myanmar, and some of these countries like Cambodia, but I would say if we're thinking about this collectively as Southeast Asia as a regional grouping, if the question from these countries is we don't really see a big stake in the South China Sea, then it has to be a bit of a give and take. So if countries, the claimant states, want these countries to care more about the South China Sea, that involves these countries in maritime Southeast Asia also caring a little bit more about the Mekong sub-region and those issues. And I think we're starting to see that in defense of ASEAN. We're starting to see a lot more engagement on the Mekong issue as a sub-regional issue. And as long as there's a give and take, consensus doesn't necessarily have to mean that everybody has to agree with 100% of things all the time. It just has to mean give and take. And if you can have layers of sort of unity on certain issues and a few divisions that are done on the basis of compromise when you arrive at a statement. But that, to my mind, is the issue. I think it's a structural issue. It doesn't really have to do with as much an individual country or who's chairing the grouping every year.
All right. Daniela, would you like to answer the question about the COC? What is the value, at least in the perspective of Germany and maybe EU?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it was already said a lot, so I would just like to add that I think it's important for ASEAN to be a stronger group, I think, to resolve the dispute they are having amongst each other. And if this can be done with a COC, which is only followed by the ASEAN members, I think it would be actually a good thing. Maybe one thought about the minilaterals and multilateralism, because it reminds me a little bit of discussions we are also having in Europe about the European Union. And I feel there were always countries and groups of countries which were ready to move together on a certain issue. And I think it always had spillover effects and was driving the whole organization. So I think it's, to my mind, when I look at Europe and the experience we are having there, it was not so much that it was undermining, like the European Union in this case, but it was more driving, because you sometimes have countries which are ready to move on certain issues, and others might join later if they see that it's a successful cooperation. So probably these two sorts.
All right, Dr. Alma, on the value of the COC.
I think in reality, what we're confronted with is our two levels of enforcement of the COC. I don't think the COC can be enforced at the level by which what's at stake would be maritime boundaries or sovereignty-related issues, because at the regional or at the international level, enforcement by hidden hand or by, I would say, something extra-regional or supranational is hard to come by, considering the fact that, for instance, China, in this case, is unable to accept the arbitral award as something that does not apply to itself. The second level of possible enforcement of rules for the code of conduct would probably refer to those rules that would govern non-traditional security issues, such as, for instance, reduction of the use of plastics, some kind of ocean governance wherein you would look into the protection of natural resources or marine resources in some areas of concern. But in reality, enforcement should really rest on domestic capability, so that, for instance, even in the Philippines, our own type of monitoring of our Sulawesi waters are basically hinged on coordination and not really hardcore enforcement. Because at the regional level, I don't think law enforcement really is problematic.
I'll just add on, or rather reiterate what I said. that in the ASEAN, if you look at Vietnam and Indonesia, they've already bilaterally settled a maritime delimitation issue. So I don't foresee a problem as long as I said earlier, the political will and the character, that is there. And if the two countries, so how will the COC come into play in the ASEAN? It's not really a question of how. It is already happening. It just needs to be extended to the other countries if they have a maritime delimitation issue. But insofar as getting China on board on this, well, as I said earlier, if they have not obeyed and if they have not abided by an earlier award, I don't see them doing it now, even if the COC was. And COC is anyway silent on the binding clause. It does not state that explicitly. So I don't see COC helping out in that matter.
Well, this one is louder. All right. I'd like to address first the comment of Prashant about the structure in ASEAN. I kind of agree and disagree with that, because as Southeast Asian, I think we have a tradition. This is a proprietary right for ASEAN to have that kind of structure, which I think is working on in the region. And definitely, it's not about the structure, perhaps, but perhaps how these countries deal with these issues, because it has to evolve. ASEAN has to mature and think of innovative ways on how to address its own issues. About the COC, I agree that the COC will not answer our problem on the West or the South China Sea because of the upper hand that Beijing has on it, and the lack of appreciation of China when it comes to international law and rules-based order. And that's the reason why we are pushing for unilateralism, so that at least those claimant countries will have a common denominator on their understanding when it comes to written behaviors. What I would suggest would be on the rules of engagement. There should be rules that are objective, scientific, and agreed by the international community. And that's where we would uplift unilaterals to multilateralism. So rules of engagement would be better than the COC. Thank you.
All right, and with that said, we would like to thank our speakers for a very comprehensive discussion. Dr. Prashant Parameswaran, Ms. Daniela Braun, Dr. Alma Salvador, Commodore Debesh Lahiri, and Dr. Chester Cabaza. Let's all give them a big round of applause. All right, thank you. And before we go to the second panel, let's have a photo opportunity first. Maybe call on Professor Dindo Manhit. Thank you very much again to our speakers. And moving on to our next panel, I would like to introduce our next moderator, former news correspondent for Defense of ABS-CBN and non-resident adjunct fellow of the Southeast Asia program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Ms. Shara Zambrano.
Hello, everyone. Let's give the staff a few seconds to clean this area out so you'll be able to see everyone clearly. Okay, I think we can start. The second half of our forum today is called Advancing an Ironclad Alliance in Defending a Rules-Based International Order in the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific region. Okay. On second thought, I think I'll wait for the others to settle down. Kindly take your seats, everyone, so we can resume. Thank you. All right, I'm already seeing some of the speakers here in my part of the room. Okay, guys, let's start. Our second panel will be talking about advancing an ironclad alliance in defending a rules-based international order in the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific region. To me, it sounds like a mouthful and also aspirational in a sense. It's asking us a question of how do we put our collective voices together and generate a power, a force significant enough to end the belligerence in the South China Sea, to create the atmosphere and the environment that we're all aspiring to. An environment in the South China Sea where rules matter, where international law prevails, and where everyone has a chance at peace and prosperity because everyone is following the rules. Our second set of panelists will be giving us the Philippine perspective of things in this whole conversation. It's a mix of experts in the academe and veterans who have vast experience in the field. And together, hopefully, when they put their heads together, maybe we can figure out how these big ideas, these big theories and concepts sometimes clash with the realities on the ground. And maybe together we can figure out how to go about it and how to work around it. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our speakers for the second panel. First, may I invite you to stand up so people can see you. Rear Admiral Rommel Jude Ong. He's a professor of practice in the Ateneo School of Government, a trustee as well at the Foundation for National Interest. Okay. Our second speaker is Dr. Renato De Castro. He's a trustee and program convener for Strat-based ADR Institute. He's also a professor of international studies in De La Salle University. Dr. De Castro over here. And we have Dr. Robin Michael Garcia. He's a non-resident fellow of Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute as well. He's the founder of the WR Advisory Group. He's an assistant professor in the School of Social Sciences, Law, and Governance of the University of Asia and the Pacific. It's Dr. Garcia. We do have a fourth speaker who unfortunately is unable to join us today because he has a previous engagement with the Armed Forces of the Philippines, but he was kind enough to leave us a video message that we can take apart and pick his brain with. He is Mr. Orlando Orly Mercado, the former Secretary of National Defense and also former Senator of the Philippines. So later, he'll be on that screen and we can listen to his thoughts. Okay, gentlemen, we can all take our seats. And I think, Admiral Ong, everyone gets 5 minutes to speak as well. Let's start with Admiral Ong. Do you have a microphone? I will lend you mine. Here you go.
Thank you, Shara. Thank you, Shara. I thought I was the second speaker. Anyway, I have 5 minutes, so I will be using 2 slides for my presentation. The first one, I'd like to frame yung narrative in terms of where we are in terms of ASEAN, Indo-Pacific, and where should the Philippines situate itself. No. Now for ASEAN, we're all aware that ASEAN tries to avoid or is trying to avoid getting in the middle of what we call the U.S.-China strategic competition, and it's basically hedging. Okay, as a multilateral institution and among its members, basically they're hedging, and they're wary of the Quad. Okay, they're wary of the Quad, and as far as ASEAN is concerned, we have to admit the efficacy of China's geoeconomic strategy and how it impacts on its relations with ASEAN. Okay. In another lecture, I would call it China's geoeconomic insurgency. But for this presentation, we'll just stick to it as a geoeconomic strategy. Okay. That more or less enmeshes yung relations between ASEAN. Okay. Now, as far as the U.S. is concerned, and that is yung issue of U.S. vis-a-vis ASEAN, there are domestic political issues within the U.S. that prevents it from actually saying the three words that are important to the ears of ASEAN: free trade agreement. Okay, and because of that, U.S. is losing out in the geoeconomic competition. Okay. Now, in this case, and vis-a-vis where Philippines situate itself, when we look at ASEAN, ASEAN would not be a reliable actor in terms of addressing yung concerns natin sa South China Sea or restoring regional stability in Southeast Asia. Okay, because of that context. Now, because of this, we're now looking at the development of minilaterals, and I think this was discussed in the previous panel about minilaterals. And we have several manifestations of these minilaterals currently in play. Of course, the foremost would be Quad. Second would be AUKUS. Okay, we're also looking at a trilateral arrangement between the U.S., Japan, and Republic of Korea. And they recently had this meeting at Camp David in the United States. So more or less, meron ng traction yon. Okay, we're looking at emerging trilateral arrangements also between U.S., Japan, and Australia. And of course, another one would be between the Philippines, us, the United States, and Japan. Okay, so given this context, we now look at the Philippines. How do we now situate ourselves? Okay, we just recently in this year had separate bilateral security dialogues with the US and Japan. Okay, and one good thing about both dialogues, which are security dialogues, no, but there is an economic component in both dialogues, in both 2+2s, and we see here a recognition that at least for the Philippines and those two countries, that we need to speak not only on security issues, but we need to address yung economic concerns ng Philippines. And I think this is being addressed. Okay. And we're now looking at an emerging trilateral arrangement between, of course, the Philippines, the US, and Japan. There have already been several meetings towards this development. Recently, we are looking at an increasing or emerging increase in operational tempo between the relation between Australia and the Philippines as well. Okay, so there are some conversations I had na why not look at the Philippine, Australia, US, Japan Quad. My personal view is it seems that Australia is not interested in that type of arrangement. So. And I think this is a manifestation of, I think Australia wants to go it alone in terms of security engagement with the Philippines and not part of a unilateral configuration. Okay. We've recently had yung Coast Guard activities between the US, Japan, and India in different modalities and in different engagements. Okay, so this is a totally different type of engagement, no? Not military, but rather between law enforcement agencies. That may also be a way forward as well. Okay. Now, as far as the other countries, we need to look at both India and the Republic of Korea as part of our defense logistics requirement to support the Philippines' defense logistics requirements. Okay. ROK is at least from a Navy perspective, ROK is the source of our frigates and corvettes, and of course, India is the source of the BrahMos anti-ship missile, which will be, I think, delivered within this year. Okay. We also need to look at how the Philippines can situate itself as part of the defense supply chain of the United States in terms of low-end type equipment. While we are having EDCA, which situates pre-deployment of U.S. equipment here, but there are supply chain type issues that need to be addressed, like simple bullets, armored vest, or combat boots. Those are low-end type concerns that may need to be addressed in terms of supply chain. Okay. We need to develop the domestic shipbuilding capability, not only to support the Philippine requirement, but maybe to also assist the United States later on in terms of helping in closing the gap between the US Navy and the PLA Navy in terms of the combatant vessel imbalance. Okay. And lastly, we're looking at maybe a potential for increased cooperation between the Philippines and Vietnam. And I think the President Marcos will be going to Vietnam this January. And I think the significance of that potential engagement between Philippines and Vietnam was predicated on the recent attacks on Vietnam here in the Philippines in media. And I think that China saw something that we haven't seen yet. Maybe they're afraid of a Philippine-Vietnam closer relation. Next slide. 2 slides lang ako. I used this in a workshop in Singapore last July. It's a discussion between the potential for engagement between ASEAN and Quad. Okay, and I presented this. My thesis was, it's not going to work. Okay, ASEAN doesn't want to play with Quad. Okay, but my counter proposition was maybe a better solution would be look at trying to deconstruct Quad and look at the 4 players. And I see that maybe India can have a better engagement with ASEAN rather than the entire Quad or rather than the US. Okay? And I see this because of course, they are part of Asia. More or less, we share the value systems are the same, and of course, the proximity. And we have some strategic, there's a convergence in terms of strategic interests. Malacca Strait, Indian Ocean, etc. Okay. Second would be, and I deconstructed in the way that maybe the Quad can look at notional spheres of cooperation. So with India and ASEAN cooperating, maybe, and we have, the other one would be Philippines, Japan, and the US working towards its arrangements towards the security in the first island chain. And I also included in open-close parentheses, Republic of Taiwan. Because Taiwan is the elephant in the room, whether we like it or not, because it's part of the first island chain, whether we deal with them in a track 1 mode, or a track 2 mode, or a track 1.5 mode, the bottom line is we still need to talk to Taiwan. And the third component of that sphere of cooperation I'm looking at would be the Mid-Pacific. And this is where the other players are concerned. France, the US, the island states in the Mid-Pacific. And I brought this out because I am personally concerned about developments in the Solomon Islands. Okay? Now, there's not much conversation here in Manila about the Solomon Islands. But mind you, if the China gets its boots on the ground in the Solomon Islands, we will feel how it is to be a chicken sandwich. Okay? Kasi we will be in the middle of the first island chain and the second island chain. Okay? We will be, from a military standpoint, encircled. Okay? The east side of the Philippines is what we call our strategic rear. Ang kalaban lang doon, Baguio. Okay? But if things develop there in the Mid-Pacific, then we need to look at both the west and the eastern front as theaters of operations. And that is going to be a resource-intensive undertaking. So I end with that. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Admiral Ong. Dr. De Castro, maybe you'd like to take a crack at it next.
Okay. Before I do my short presentation, I have to make a denial. we do not constitute the Council of Trent. You know, I'm from De La Salle University. Admiral Ong is from Ateneo, and of course, Dr. Garcia is from the University of the Asia and the Pacific. We're all come from Catholic universities. So this is, you know, it has nothing to do with being part of the Council of Trent and trying to initiate a counter-reformation. So my presentation today focus on looking at not only in terms of Philippine-US alliance, but more on the Philippines, ASEAN, and of course looking at the United States. So looking in terms of how the Philippines, ASEAN could basically maximize its relationship with the United States, and of course also vice versa. So the original topic of my presentation is looking at the US-ASEAN dialogue partnership in an era of a changing Indo-Pacific region. So my presentation is actually about 54 slides, but we simply don't have enough time. So the basis of my presentation, of course, is trying to assess the sort of evolving partnership between the United States and ASEAN in the light of the ongoing US-China strategic rivalry. Well, first of all, the US-ASEAN dialogue partnership is an odd couple because historically, both sides represented two diametrically opposed forms of how security should be enhanced in the region. The US, of course, represents the center of what we call the hub and spoke system of alliances. The United States, of course, maintain alliances, including with the Philippines, and of course, the goal of alliance is war fighting, deterrence, so forth and so on. ASEAN is also a security institution, but definitely it's not an alliance. Although it is a product of the Cold War, ASEAN prides itself as being non-communist. It has a different approach in terms, of course, of security. First of all, ASEAN's approach in security is a getting-to-know party among the 5 original member states who, of course, were nearly in the verge of conflict when ASEAN was formed in 1967. And more significantly, a point I raised, ASEAN, even up to now, is a forum of middle and small powers whose goal, of course, is to generate relative autonomy from the great powers. Although ASEAN have different approaches on how they try to achieve relative autonomy. Historically, we go back, of course, in the late 1970s, late 60s and early 70s. ASEAN approach is based on what you call, number one, equibalancing. You try to basically make sure that great powers converge at a given point in time with the hope that they balance each other, and at the same time also, if the push comes to shove, try to distance. So let me start with my first slide. I only have about, I think, 6, and I'll be very fast, I promise. So I have a different take in compared to my colleague from our rival university, especially when it comes to basketball. Although publicly ASEAN would say, we don't want to get involved with competition, ASEAN actually thrives on competition. You going back during the Vietnam War, we go back, of course, during the Cold War when Vietnam invaded, of course, Cambodia, how ASEAN, tried to utilize the Sino-Soviet rivalry at that time. So ASEAN historically has relied on either equibalancing or equidistancing in interacting with the major powers. Next slide, please. So what's basically the U.S. approach? The U.S. should never expect ASEAN to totally align with U.S. interests. The Philippines, of course, is an exception. Thailand, of course, is a problem. But the whole of ASEAN, even when we talk about Cambodia, Laos, being close to China, they're not actually very comfortable with being seen as client state of China. Inside every Cambodian, Lao, and Myanmar, people from Myanmar, they want also to exercise a degree of autonomy from China. They don't have, of course, the strategic and diplomatic space that the maritime Southeast Asian countries enjoy, like the Philippines, Vietnam, of course, given Vietnam's history, the only country in the world that have defeated 3 members of the Security Council. Again, Vietnam is an exception. But for the maritime Southeast Asian countries, we have greater leeway. But at the end of the day, ASEAN, although they have differences in terms of geography, in terms of outlook, have one thing in common. They want relative autonomy from any of the great powers. So the role of the U.S., of course, is to print upon ASEAN that its presence as the strategic offshore balancer in the region is aimed to ensure that the regional allies could continue playing the game. That is actually, that China is a spoiler. China wants basically to transform Southeast Asia into its living space, a Lebensraum. A U.S. goal is not, of course, to dominate the region, is to maintain its role as a strategic offshore balancer, ensuring that no single power dominates the region. Next slide, please. So continuously, of course, to explain to ASEAN that the U.S. grand strategy of the free and open Indo-Pacific is actually a reiteration of the long-standing U.S. interests in the region since the beginning of the 1900s, ensuring that the region remains open to American business and investment, and ensuring that there is a balance of power system in the region. No single state should dominate the region and prevent American capital business from entering into the area. So, of course, explaining that, in fact, U.S. presence enables ASEAN not simply to align. Of course, again, a point in the Philippines, we are an exception rather than the rule, but for the rest of ASEAN, the role of the U.S. is to ensure ASEAN could always play this game of constant flirtation with the great powers. Next slide, please. So engage ASEAN in an open, candid discourse on how the free and Indo-open strategy can converge with the ASEAN outlook. Of course, there's supposed to be differences, but the challenge for the United States and ASEAN is to find convergence between the free and open Indo-Pacific, along, of course, with the other Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad. Again, a point raised by Admiral Ong. There's no way that ASEAN would trust Quad, but at least there could be a negotiation regarding the convergence between the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and the free and open Indo-Pacific. Next slide. So maintain and possibly enhance American symbolic presence in annual ASEAN rituals. Of course, this one, I don't know if it will happen again, but unfortunately, President Joe Biden was not able to attend the summit in Jakarta, but he was there in the G20 summit in Delhi. Okay, but of course he visited Vietnam, and this is again interesting game. Not because the United States want Vietnam to be its ally, that will of course never happen. But of course, trying to ensure Vietnam, you could always play that game because we're here. Next slide. So assure ASEAN that the U.S. will never force its member states to make a choice between Washington and Beijing, since its competition with China actually, suits the goal not only of the maritime Southeast Asian state, nor the continental Southeast Asian state, but the whole, because it provides them the opportunity to play its diplomatic game of either equibalancing or equidistancing from the great powers. Next slide, please. I think they foster U.S.-ASEAN cooperation on maritime security, cyber security, counter transnational crimes, strengthening border control, security against illegal migrants. Of course, ASEAN accept the fact that China's economic relation with ASEAN is a given. We're discussing it, but they don't like the externalities. The fact that being the economically dominant power in the region also enables China to bully several Southeast Asian countries, especially the maritime Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. So this is where the United States would have to play a very important role. Next slide, please. So again, the U.S. could never do it alone, harness other U.S. ally, Japan, Australia, in enhancing the U.S. role. And this is a key point that enables ASEAN to play its game. Not, of course, as the primary guarantor of security, because again, the Philippines and Thailand this is the only two ASEAN countries that would accept this role, especially, of course, the Philippines, in the light of what's happening not only in the South China Sea, but also in Taiwan, but for the rest of the ASEAN countries, Singapore, Vietnam, the United States is seen as the honest broker, this quoting, of course, the late Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, because it's an external power, and more significantly, the U.S. practice of being the strategic offshore balancer. All countries will have to take into account that the United States has, of course, the predominant naval presence in the region. Last, I think that's the end of it. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to an interesting conversation after this presentation. Okay. You can now say amen. Later.
Hello.
Okay, thank you, Dr. De Castro. Thank you for those very quirky graphics that you made it all the more interesting and very visual. Okay, our third speaker will be given 5 minutes to present, Dr. Robin Michael Garcia.
Good morning, everyone. I'll diverge a little bit. I don't have a presentation, but my comments will revolve around the nature of alliances and the nature of threat for the ASEAN. So I'm also a member of the 24-person expert group convened by Speaker Martin Romualdez. So I'm one of the Congressional Research Fellows for Peace and Security at the House of Representatives. I'm also an incoming visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll be traveling to the United States in November. So my research in the University of Pennsylvania actually will revolve around Taiwan issue. And so that's my first point. I think that the ASEAN should think and talk more about Taiwan. And the Philippines should talk more about Taiwan. The issue of Taiwan for the Philippines currently is an issue of repatriation, or repatriation of overseas Filipino workers. I don't think that's the biggest threat when China invades Taiwan, or if China invades Taiwan. It was mentioned by the two previous speakers very eloquently in passing also that Taiwan is part of the first island chain. And that means that if China takes Taiwan, it will have fortified its position when it decides to take the Philippines. No? So it is not an OFW issue. It is a security and existential issue for the Philippines. The national security policy does not talk about that. I don't think the media and the scholars are talking about it in that frame and in that context. So that's my first comment. And therefore, the ASEAN should talk more about the issue of Taiwan as well, and not just the Philippines. The second thing I want to say is that we really need to be cognizant of intra-ASEAN territorial disputes that was mentioned earlier in the first panel, but I also want to emphasize that. So these are disputes among ASEAN countries. But I want to add to the discussion by saying that the disinformation drive of China actually draws upon the intra-ASEAN disputes. It tries to divide the ASEAN by invoking that Vietnam has more outposts or a lot of outposts in the South China Sea, which is quite true. But the level of threat of Vietnam is quite different from the level of threat of China, and the presence of outposts does not necessarily mean conflict, or does not necessarily mean that it's threatening to national security of the Philippines. Vietnam and the Philippines is more interested in talking than China and the Philippines, right? So it's quite different. But we need to understand that intra-ASEAN disputes are a hindrance towards common security and towards institutionalization of cooperation. And then, of course, you have the issue of the code of conduct. There were conversations it's been a long-running conversation, but I want to emphasize also the bid towards demilitarization. And the provision for demilitarization is important in the code of conduct. And when China agrees to that, and everyone agrees to that, then that will make the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea a more peaceful place. The next thing I want to say is that what came out of, at the Congressional Research Fellows, we invited strat-based, we invited some scholars here, Dr. Chester, Dr. Alma, Rear Admiral Zhu Dong, and Dr. De Castro were invited. So we did a focus group discussion last week. We just concluded that one of the things that came out of the focus group discussions is that we need to manage our allies better. We don't have a program for alliance management. We crystal ball everything, right? So we need to think about how to make our partners more accountable, and what are we supposed to do when managing allies. one of the hindrances in alliance management is the splintered bureaucratic architecture of foreign policy in the Philippines. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that the Coast Guard is not within the DND, it's under the ambit of the Department of Transportation. And then you have the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources under the Department of Agriculture. And then you have the National Security Council and the National Intelligence Coordinating Agency under the Office of the President. And then you have politics within Department of National Defense and the Armed Forces of the Philippines. They don't know who to talk to. Our allies don't know who to talk to. And then you have reshufflings in the National Security Council, and maybe the defense chief will run for the Senate in 2025. So that has that's problematic for continuity. We have so we don't know who they don't know who to talk to. They don't know who's in charge of foreign policy. I don't think the president has been in any NTF-WPS meeting. I'm not sure, I might be wrong, but I hope that he attends more of those meetings, the National Task Force in the West Philippine Sea, to basically take command and take charge of that institution, right? So better alliance management through rationalized bureaucracy for foreign policy making. And then I also want to say, and this is the last point, that we, as in the ASEAN and in the Philippines, we have to also think about the changes next year because of the elections. The elections in the United States will be consequential for US-Philippine alliance if the United States elects former President Donald Trump for his second term. That will affect the way the US will deal with the ASEAN and the Philippines. You also have elections in Taiwan in January, right? So we have to watch that as well. And then you have the filing of candidacy for our elections in October next year, right? So we just finished electing a new president, but the filing of candidacy is in October 2024. And we have to think about how the newly elected senators in 2025 will approach the China policy of the Philippines. And so those domestic changes matter for what will happen in the region, what will happen in the Philippines. So yeah, I'd like to stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. And if we have our video ready, perhaps we can now listen to Senator Orly Mercado give his statement.
I'd like to thank Struck-based ADR for inviting me to share my insights on this forum on advancing an ironclad alliance and defending a rules-based international order in the ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific region. Now, I'd like to thank Struck-based ADR for inviting me to share my insights on this forum on advancing an ironclad alliance and defending a rules-based international order in the ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific region. Now, this is a very broad topic, and we have been given some suggestions. I would like to just focus on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I've had the opportunity of being the first Philippine permanent representative, and I have a little bit of familiarity, I guess, because of that experience on the workings of the ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has benefited in terms of economic and social cultural cooperation and has produced stability since its establishment in 1967. Its member states are following the charter, and there is a way of doing things called the ASEAN way, where tenets are agreed upon. I would like to just spend a very short, just to mention non-interference in internal affairs, rejection of multilateral military agreements, preference for consultation, and consensus building, and this is in decision-making as well. Now, there are big questions on the ASEAN way. Some pundits have said that in addressing issues of high politics, it may not be as timely anymore. However, there are those who say that if you look back, you will find out that the consensus mechanism has worked, and there has been no serious security problems. Of course, this is debatable in certain instances with the recent developments. And the recent ASEAN Summit, hosted by Indonesia, has brought back the question of the significance of ASEAN in the dynamics that's happening in this particular region. Now, these two issues are contentious. There are those that say that it's difficult to reach an effective, for example, response to the civil unrest in Myanmar. The 5-point peace timeline in 2021 was barely fulfilled. We also have a growing dispute. All of us know about what was happening in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, and this has become aggravated by the aggressive Coast Guard and Maritime militias of China, and there have been attempts also to develop a code of conduct, but this has been also brought to a long dragging mechanism that hasn't produced results. Now, the group is often seen returning to the drawing board to reach a consensus. And there are comments that I have read that have opined that even recently, the absence of US President Joe Biden and China President Xi Jinping in the summit demonstrates that ASEAN's capacity as a platform for addressing geopolitical tensions in the region produces an optic that is not positive for the organization. Now, the fifth largest economy in the world is tripping on its toes, and the issue that also comes up as a consequence of this examination concerns also what is called ASEAN centrality. The motive of becoming a dominant regional platform to overcome common challenges and engage external powers. This multi-headed creature facing different directions that we have, they say, cannot move forward. So there is a very important requirement now for us to be able to identify our own diverging interests, core interests especially, and we should really, at this particular point, re-examine what ASEAN can do and what it cannot do. We do know that we have had problems when there were countries like Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and had a different view as regards the military government in Myanmar as the other members of the ASEAN. Now, indeed, there are many things that have to be considered, but non-interference and consensus building really are focuses that sometimes we find difficult in finding solutions that are complicated. ASEAN's soft and informal approach may not be sufficient. It puts a premium on individual countries' bilateral military agreements instead of moving together. And I have written some articles, especially in 2017, that the organization is faced with two policy options. One, to modify or reinvent the ASEAN way, or two, to completely abandon it. If it chooses to maintain the status quo, I believe it will run the risk of being downplayed as a talking shop. The ASEAN member states should also be able to see that giving up some aspects of its sovereignty can help achieve the goal, the common goal, paradoxically, which is actually the key to becoming a more effective regional organization. We can move cohesively as a bloc and shared sovereignty in a way, however elusive it is, can be properly defined. Now, the organization must develop mechanisms to enforce agreements and decisions, ensuring accountability. And it's also critical that the new ASEAN way, or whatever we may change in the ASEAN way, should actively seek strategic alliance with like-minded external powers to uphold a rules-based international order. This is not Cold War 2.0. Non-alignment may put Southeast Asia in a more precarious position between two rival superpowers. However, in resolving the South China Sea disputes, it is very important that we strengthen the enforcement mechanism of what we agree upon, enhance dialogue, form strategic alliances, and develop a comprehensive regional security framework. ASEAN can evolve beyond the ASEAN way and better address the concerns confronting the region. As I often say, and often quote, Kevin Rudd's advice is something that we should be heeding. He says that countries like us, especially the claimant countries in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, must move as a pack rather than as lone wolves. Thank you very much.
That was Senator Orly Mercado, who pretty much illustrated and put to simple words the question that I'd like to present to the panel. We've heard a range of sentiment about the ASEAN, from utter lack of confidence to a bit more optimism. I'd like to ask you three, given what we've heard and what you've said, is there now a case to be made about abandoning the ASEAN altogether? Or does it have to be that drastic? Do you still see a way around it that we can still extract some benefit from being a part of the ASEAN? Dr. De Castro, maybe we can start with you and move it down the line.
My answer is definitely yes. ASEAN has its strengths and its weakness. And of course, it's part of our approach that we're also given a sort of a menu. We have, of course, an important one, the alliance with the United States. We look at positively AUKUS Quad. That's basically our difference in terms of our relationship with ASEAN. Within ASEAN, again, we have to also understand the division within ASEAN. The Philippines is part of what we call the Maritime portion of ASEAN. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. We could tap this in terms of a coalition of the willing within ASEAN, looking at, of course, the maritime issue is a concern of maritime Southeast Asia, but at the same time understanding that the continental power countries of ASEAN, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, have a different interest. It's not, again, it's a matter of understanding. They have their own issues with China, and that has to do with the Mekong River. So it's not saying in terms of a division, but saying in terms of a division of labor within ASEAN. And of course, as a whole of ASEAN, we need the whole of ASEAN to be able to play this game of equibalancing. The important thing, of course, is to take into account the Singaporean position regarding ASEAN. And this is something I really admire from the Singaporean. No? Great powers are a reality of international relations, and this is something that we have to take into account. Thank you very much.
For ASEAN, I think, one, we need to level our expectations. First off, it was not organized as a defense or security undertaking. It's basically socio-cultural economic. Okay. The emergence of the ASEAN political security community was fairly recent. Of course, may manifestations ngayon in ADMM, yung ASEAN Defense Minister meeting. It's playing catch-up in terms of trying to look at defense and security as one of the key areas of engagement within ASEAN and even among the dialogue partners. But again, the key word is leveling of expectations. There are things that ASEAN is not able to do, and we need to be aware of that. Let's be realistic. Second, I don't think ASEAN is monolithic in terms of decision-making. We need to look at ASEAN as a dynamic organization. They converge on certain issues. They will diverge on certain issues. Now, for my personal experience, the best I can example of a defense and security type of undertaking that work does not involve the entire ASEAN. It only involves a few members of ASEAN, and I'm referring to the trilateral cooperative arrangement in Dumalfi, that's between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So that came about because of a convergence of interests. We need to secure the Sulu-Sulu SSCs from transnational terrorism, particularly yung Abu Sayyaf, they decide to migrate their activities to the neighboring countries. So meron but it's not a multilateral effort, it's a minilateral effort. So that's the second point. They will diverge in certain issues, they will converge in certain issues. It's a country-to-country decision. It's not a monolithic decision because there's no standing committee in ASEAN that is sustained through the years. Every year, nagpapalit yung chairmanship. And each chairman state brings a different flavor to yung chairmanship nila for the year of their tenure. Okay, thank you.
I think that's a difficult question, actually. But one of the fascinating things about the ASEAN is that the ASEAN is there. So if you look at the history of East Asia, so East Asia can be divided into Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. So Northeast Asia is Japan, South Korea, Mongolia, China, Taiwan. They never formed any institution. But ASEAN was able to create an institution and sort of aggregate themselves into something. So I think that's quite important to understand. And when we think about ASEAN centrality, that became the location for those conversations in the whole East Asia. So it didn't happen in Northeast Asia, it happened in Southeast Asia. So ASEAN +3 and all of these regional arrangements within the ASEAN that began with ASEAN. So that's, I think we have to credit, to look at it in that frame too. But actually last night I had a graduate class, and there was a notion that was raised by some graduate students, that ASEAN seems to be just a glorified events organizer. When they gather people, they take pictures, they fix their hair, they wear suits, and that's it, right? So, but to me, any type of institution has some value. It, from a theoretical perspective, it reduces asymmetry, it coordinates movement and things like that. We are still far from the ASEAN economic community that we're supposed to accomplish by 2025. But at least there's a conversation happening towards many things, right? That otherwise wouldn't have happened if the ASEAN was not there. So I think conversations matter, and it happens in the ASEAN.
Admiral Ong, I'll start with you and maybe others can pipe in. Do you feel like the Philippine government has its expectations properly managed about the ASEAN? Or do you feel like maybe there needs to be some kind of reckoning and reorienting some of the efforts towards the minilateral approaches that you've explained in your slides a while ago?
I think yes. I go by the intervention of the President Marcos during the recent ASEAN meeting in Jakarta. Number one, the Philippines did not push for an ASEAN statement on the South China Sea. That means it has we had a realistic appraisal of the lay of the ground. Okay, we do not want we avoided a scenario like the Cambodia chairmanship a few years ago, when nothing was signed. So what the President did was actually an intervention, and he was able to articulate position ng Philippines as far as the South China Sea is concerned. And he did not burden the other ASEAN members with that intervention. Inako natin yun. We own that statement, and we own that perspective. Okay. We did not burden the other members with our concern. But in a way, it's also like a throwing the gauntlet to ASEAN as a challenge, because we are saying this in the intervention because we realistically say, hindi naman kayo maaasahan dito sa magsalita na lang mag-isa. So I think in a way, it's also a parang a challenge to ASEAN to step up also. Thank you.
Can you speak to the language of the statement of the ASEAN leadership? It wasn't,
Yeah,
of course,
okay.
it wasn't
I'll-
the strongest.
I'll support Admiral Ong. No? We have to take into account we have to commend the President for his acumen, understanding of the context. There are two elements there that you have to take into account. Number one, of course, was the fact that the intervention in the ASEAN summit happened just a few days after China came out with the official map, which of course caused for ASEAN member states to really raise hell. And more significantly, it's Malaysia who led the charge. Malaysia has always maintained a policy of quiet diplomacy. You know, I was in Malaysia just last month during the Asia-Pacific Roundtable, and the Malaysians would always tell me, compared to you Filipinos, we have this quiet diplomacy. We do it quietly with the Chinese. Not this time. You know, they came out strong. The Philippines have to follow suit. You know, it rattled the Department of Foreign Affairs that the country that adopts the policy of quiet diplomacy vis-a-vis China came out, as you know, after India. Then, of course, other ASEAN countries followed, Vietnam, even Brunei. So the condition was there. And more significantly, it's a matter of timing. Just want to clarification, it's not an ASEAN statement, it's a statement of the chair. And interestingly, the statement of the chair of ASEAN is Indonesia. Indonesia is a maritime Southeast Asian country. It converges with our interests. Of course, although it's not a claimant state, Indonesia is not very happy that, of course, the waters of the north of the Natuna Island was included in the map. So again, it was welcomed by Indonesia. So I don't think the spoilers, Cambodia, Vietnam, understood the fact that when it comes, of course, with the chairman communique, it's the host country that has, of course, the most prerogative. So there was no opposition from countries that we considered as friendly to China. So in a way, it's an exercise of what I call ASEAN abilities for equibalancing.
I don't understand the question. What's the question again?
The question was, do you think we have our expectations set right when it comes to the ASEAN, or do you think there needs to be a reorientation or like a shifting of effort, a little less on ASEAN and more on the unilateral approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these conversations can coexist. We don't have to abandon ASEAN. I think it's a great opportunity for a lot of people to talk to talk. But there is value in these emerging institutions and avenues. So I guess we'll see if which one emerges as the most important avenue.
I have a question. Well, I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure you guys out there have your own. Do raise your hands if you'd like to ask something of the panel. Yes, sir. Kindly introduce yourself, sir.
Afternoon. My name is Rui Moreno. I just have, along the points that the President made within ASEAN, I think the fact that the President made those points, at least it's on the record. So you use ASEAN as a platform to make the statement. That's first. Second, I think that not only Malaysia was happy, Vietnam was happy with that statement. Vietnam has always said that they admire the Philippines because the Philippines has openly said what they want and what they feel. Unfortunately, they're tied up with Russia, and of course they have to manage China. And that's what brings me to my next point, which is, I wonder, and this is what I've been thinking of, I wonder if this strategic partnership that Vietnam has raised the US to, same level as Russia, China, India, and South Korea. I wonder if that is because both China and the US want to use Vietnam as a dialogue, neutral dialogue. Because, for example, Korea, they cannot use Korea to talk to China because Korea doesn't want to and vice versa. They cannot use Japan to talk to China. They cannot use the Philippines to talk to China because very clearly that's where our interests are not. But on the other hand, the fact that Vietnam raised that partnership to a strategic level meant that they had to clear that with Beijing. They had to coordinate that with Beijing. On the other hand, make it that appear that it is not strictly military, the Americans said, okay, we will now allow you to encourage all these American companies coming out of China to move to Vietnam. So that is why my thinking is that perhaps they're trying to keep that dialogue open in a more less, shall we say, public way.
Yes, among, of course, the 10 ASEAN member states, is Vietnam that's really, what I call this, an expert. You know, it knows how to play. You know, how it played, of course, during the Vietnam War, how it was able to harness two competing communist powers, the Soviet Union and China. At the time that the Soviet Union and China were about to fight a war. You know, Gromyko, they said to Henry Kissinger at that time, what will the United States do if we would nuke China? But of course, Vietnam was able to harness them. Then of course, after the war, Vietnam changed siding more with the Soviet Union at the expense of China. You know, that's why, you know, Vietnam is the most qualified country to do so. And of course, you have two other factors. Aside from the fact that Vietnam is a great player when it comes to this, Vietnam and China are communist countries. So again, they link, and more importantly, this is something that the 9 ASEAN member states do not have, that Vietnam has the luxury of having. When push comes to shove with the relationship with China, they have the inter-party committee. That's where they start talking that, you know, you help us during the siege of Dien Bien Phu. You know, I have a tension with God. I have seen it in my own eyes, how the Vietnamese would play the game. This is something that no ASEAN member states has. That's why, again, this is a classic example of what I call statecraft. On both sides, the U.S. relying on Vietnam to basically try to manage the tension, you know, at the same time, Vietnam benefiting from the best of two worlds.
Any more questions?
Sige, I'll just add to that.
Oh, yes.
Okay, in my limited engagement with the Vietnamese embassy people before, I think they had this fascination with the Philippine-US alliance, okay, the Mutual Defense Treaty. And ang akin siguro, parang how do we develop a similar mechanism for Vietnam? Of course, that was my logical conclusion of yung conversation. Now, in the recent development of the comprehensive strategic partnership, I would look at it as a signaling. Second is, most likely, it will be used for leverage. I mean, leverage in terms of, now I have this partnership with the US. China, you watch out. You be more friendly with me. Granted na they're both communist countries, but of course, in terms of strategic interest, there are things that definitely at play. So I think it's a signaling, a political signaling, a diplomatic signaling, and second, it most likely will be used as a leverage in terms of yung managing relations between Vietnam and China. Thank you.
Okay, let's shift our attention to the events on the ground or at sea of late. We've already said this before. The Philippines right now is in a much better state compared to, in terms of the South China Sea, as compared to how we were during the previous administration. Now we have a government who is speaking out rather decisively about the Philippine stance. This decisiveness has empowered the international community to come to our support and verbalize their stand as well. And this is the scenario that we were dreaming of and hoping for 6 years ago. And yet, what is happening on the ground, either as a result of this or for some other reason, China seems to be doubling down instead of backing out. We showed footage of the blockades, the dangerous maneuvers. We gave the world a timeline. And the next few missions, China just did it again, the exact same way. We complained about their aggression, and we wake up the next day and now we have a 10-dash line. What are we seeing here? Is this a strategy that is not working? Or are we actually seeing it work and China, this is a China that is now nervous and on edge? And I guess after that, what do we do to give more meat and teeth and strength to our words and to the statements of support from the international community in such a way that will actually move the needle in the South China Sea and see some actual physical change on the ground?
Number one, we are dealing with a state actor that has a geopolitical strategy that ang end state will end at 2040. Okay. It can incrementally manage the way it acts. It can ramp it up or it can tone it down depending on the situation. But it has a 2040 time frame. We operate at a 6-year cycle. Okay, so as you mentioned, Chara, we were better off for the previous ano. But that's this cycle. We're not even low. Pag 2028 to onward cycle, baka different na naman. So, as I said, we're dealing with a state actor that has a geopolitical strategy at play. There is consistency within this bureaucracy with regards to its execution, and it has strategic patience working for it. We are reacting to it. We don't have a long-term strategy to deal with the South China Sea issue. And normally, it's always a boom and bust cycle. Every 6 years, we have to, at least the security sector has to realign itself. Once there's that 6-year cycle, it has to adjust again. Okay. So, hindi sustainable yung ginagawa natin. Now, as far as the developments in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, particularly in the second Tama Shoal, what we're doing is we're better off compared to, again, previous actions. But there are many missing pieces to that. Being transparent and being vocal about the activities there in the West Philippine Sea is only one, sa military we call it one line of effort. There are other moving pieces that needs to be addressed. At the end of the day, at least taking the case of the second Tama Shoal lang, at the end of the day, ang issue dun is for the Philippines, we need to find a replacement for Sierra Madre to make sure that we can sustain yung position natin doon. On the Chinese side, their objective is very simple. Just prevent us from doing it. Okay. And the shift will be, eventually the shift of advantage the advantage will shift to them once bumagsak na si Sierra Madre. Okay. So we are, as I said before, time is not our friend with respect to that vessel. And time is their friend kasi they can exercise patience and just wait us out. Okay. Thank you.
I think there are a lot of things we could do and improve in terms of Philippine foreign policy towards the West Philippine Sea. We've always said that the Philippines has prioritized internal security. We have to shift to external security. I mean, in all forums, everyone says this, but right now there is a at least a more serious recognition that external security is more important. But I hope that that translates into the budget, the Philippine budget. The budget that's being talked about now is an election budget. And so they're thinking about how much they could spend for 2024, 2025. But we really have to think about external security, and therefore we need to give more to the Navy, to the Coast Guard, to basically the institutions that protect our maritime domain, and less attention to the Army. I think that's something that we've been talking about, we've been thinking about, right? So that's one. We just want to say that too. Second, I agree. We need the strategy. I am not very happy with the national security policy. I'm not sure if the other panel members feel the same, but there are things that are not there. I don't think we understand how to deal with China. We don't have a China policy. There's really just a lot of things we're not doing, we're not saying. And I don't think our institutions are talking enough. So for example, DTI, and I think that was the FGD with the government. The DTI seems to be more permissible or for economics. But I think the Philippines should use economic statecraft to punish China. We are one of the biggest suppliers of nickel to China, and nickel is an input to steel that China exports to the world. If we cripple that sort of that ability of China to get nickel from us, then maybe we can get some concessions. But we don't even know that we are a very important part of the supply chain of steel for their Belt and Road Initiative, right? I don't think there's that consciousness even among policymakers, among the business sector. So my point is, in the national security policy, we have to explicitly link economics and security. There's a talk about decoupling, but I think that's a mistake. So really, what is our strategy? We need to think about it more. I can go on and on, but maybe Professor De Castro and the other panelists have something to say about that.
Is there a case to be made about the like-minded nations considering imposing sanctions on China? Or is that even going to happen, you think? Okay, any more questions? Okay, if there aren't any questions, I think Professor Manhit is here. Yeah, okay. All right. Professor Manhit would like to say a few words to close the show and leave us with some things to think about as we depart this rather creatively crafted venue. So, Professor Dindo.
All right, we would like to thank again our second panel, led by our moderator, Shara Zambrano. Okay, Dr. Robin Garcia, Admiral Romel Ong, and Dr. Renato De Castro. And for our closing remarks, we would like to welcome again Professor Dindo Manhit.
Again, thank you to our speakers. Just a little trivia. Former Secretary Orly Mercado, it was during his tenure as Secretary of Defense when he decided to ram the boat at 2nd Thomas Shoal. And also he has served also as, I think, our ambassador to ASEAN. So he speaks from that. It's quite, he's an active member of our institute. It's just that he was asked to chair a multi-stakeholder gathering with the Armed Forces of the Philippines today. But allow me to thank our panelists, friends, colleagues who have been with us. Robin, Dr. Robbins, Admiral Rommel, Dr. Rene, who just flew in from India last night. So I'd like to share thoughts from our institute after 2 days. You know, the strength and commitment to mitigate the risk in our regional security landscape binds the Philippines with its neighbors and like-minded states. In this context, the international community shares a collective reverence for the rule of law to fight those with hegemonic ambitions. Actions of antagonistic and coercive states have no place in a world of shared peace and prosperity. Many world leaders expressed and reaffirmed mutual interest in the region through the ASEAN Summit and related summits last week. Strong narratives have been woven against those with desperate attempts to dismantle the rules-based international order. This country's positions are built on national interest and shared concerns, and this enables us to have a positive outlook in the near future. The Philippines and its ASEAN neighbors are in the right direction, while the manifestation of commitment and support to one another is the first step. The challenge for us is to how to effectively move forward. Our words need to be complemented by our actions. As a proud defender of the rules-based international order, the Philippines' economic and defense engagements with partners contribute to our individual and regional strength and security, growth and security. This position even made stronger by the support of our nation's friends, allies, and partners. Maritime cooperation among ASEAN states and their dialogue partners is a highlight of the high-level discussions. In the South China Sea context, nation-states face major hurdles in finalizing a code of conduct. To demonstrate unity and effectiveness as a regional bloc, our institute calls on the Philippines and other states to cooperate in this matter, consistent with the rule of law, through peaceful and legally binding negotiations. Beyond this, it's time for us to plan concrete actions to adhere to maritime security agreements. Furthermore, states must also be up to the challenge of developing effective measures in the South China Sea to prevent aggressive and coercive states from unilaterally asserting selfish claims. In doing so, states with rightful claims under international law must not be afraid to condemn expansionist activities in their respective territories, as the rule of law is in our side. In the Institute, we believe we are on the right side of history, and we shall not allow other states to take this away from nations like the Philippines and other claimant states in ASEAN. Let this be a source of cooperation, not competition. In the international community, without risking our national interests, it is imperative that the Philippines boost cooperation with like-minded states in the maritime domain. Together, let's position and elevate ourselves as a strong and relevant players in the Indo-Pacific region, and specifically the ASEAN region, that can push back against those who threaten the region's peace, security, stability, and prosperity. We are on our second day of discussion, and thank you for all those who participated in person and those who participated online. Again, good morning, and then let's enjoy our lunch now.
All right, on that note, we would like to thank again all our speakers and all our guests here in the venue, and also everyone who has been monitoring us online via Zoom and Facebook Live. So again, thank you for coming, and we will be serving lunch. So hope you have a great rest of the day. But before the speakers go, may we have a photo opportunity first, please? With the second panel first, and then with the second panel, and then with
Singapore ambassador, so we'll have a ASEAN representative. Ambassador, join us. We'll have Senator.
Bumalik si Jace.